Cranford. By Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskel. You are listening on Audio Library YouTube channel. Enjoy the audio. Chapter 1. Our Society. In the first place, Cranford is in possession of the Amazons. All the holders of houses above a certain rent are women. If a married couple come to settle in the town, somehow the gentleman disappears. He is either fairly frightened to death by being the only man in the Cranford evening parties, or he is accounted for by being with his regiment, his ship, or closely engaged in business all the week in the great neighboring commercial town of Drumble, distant only 20 miles on a railroad. In short, whatever does become of the gentlemen, they are not at Cranford. What could they do if they were there? The surgeon has his round of 30 miles and sleeps at Cranford, but every man cannot be a surgeon. For keeping the trim gardens full of choice flowers without a weed to speck them, for frightening away little boys who look wistfully at the said flowers through the railings, for rushing out at the geese that occasionally venture into the gardens if the gates are left open, for deciding all questions of literature and politics without troubling themselves with unnecessary reasons or arguments, for obtaining clear and correct knowledge of everybody's affairs in the parish, for keeping their neat maidservants in admirable order, for kindness, somewhat dictatorial, to the poor, and real tender good offices to each other whenever they are in distress. The ladies of Cranford are quite sufficient. A man, as one of them observed to me once, is so in the way in the house. Although the ladies of Cranford know all each other's proceedings, they are exceedingly indifferent to each other's opinions. Indeed, as each has her own individuality, not to say eccentricity, pretty strongly developed. Nothing is so easy as verbal retaliation, but, somehow, goodwill reigns among them to a considerable degree. The Cranford ladies have only an occasional little quarrel, spirited out in a few peppery words and angry jerks of the head, just enough to prevent the even tenor of their lives from becoming too flat. Their dress is very independent of fashion, as they observe. What does it signify how we dress here at Cranford, where everybody knows us? And if they go from home, their reason is equally cogent. What does it signify how we dress here, where nobody knows us? The materials of their clothes are, in general, good and plain, and most of them are nearly as scrupulous as Miss Tyler, of cleanly memory, but I will answer for it, the last gigot, the last tight and scanty petticoat in where in England was seen in Cranford and seen without a smile. Picture a magnificent family red silk umbrella. I can testify to a magnificent family red silk umbrella, under which a gentle little spinster, left alone of many brothers and sisters, used to patter to church on rainy days. Have you any red silk umbrellas in London? We had a tradition of the first that had ever been seen in Cranford, and the little boys mobbed it and called it a stick in petticoats. It might have been the very red silk one I have described, held by a strong father over a troop of little ones. The poor little lady, the survivor of all, could scarcely carry it. Then there were rules and regulations for visiting and calls, and they were announced to any young people who might be staying in the town with all the solemnity with which the old Manx laws were read once a year on the Tinwald Mount. Our friends have sent to inquire how you are after your journey. Tonight, my dear, 15 miles in a gentleman's carriage. They will give you some rest tomorrow, but the next day, I have no doubt, they will call, so be at liberty after 12. From 12 to 3 are our calling hours. Then, after they had called, it is the third day. I dare say your mamma has told you, my dear, never to let more than 3 days elapse between receiving a call and returning it, and also that you are never to stay longer than a quarter of an hour. But am I to look at my watch? How am I to find out when a quarter of an hour has passed? You must keep thinking about the time, my dear, and not allow yourself to forget it in conversation. As everybody had this rule in their minds, whether they received or paid a call, of course no absorbing subject was ever spoken about. We kept ourselves to short sentences of small talk and were punctual to our time. I imagine that a few of the gentlefolks of Cranford were poor and had some difficulty in making both ends meet, but they were like the Spartans and concealed their smart under a smiling face. We none of us spoke of money because that subject savored of commerce and trade, and though some might be poor, we were all aristocratic. The Cranfordians had that kindly esprit de corps which made them overlook all deficiencies in success when some among them tried to conceal their poverty. When Mrs. Forrester, for instance, gave a party in her baby house of a dwelling and the little maiden disturbed the ladies on the sofa by a request that she might get the tea tray out from underneath, everyone took this novel proceeding as the most natural thing in the world and talked on about household forms and ceremonies. As if we all believed that our hostess had a regular servants' hall second table with housekeeper and steward instead of the one little charity school maiden whose short ruddy arms could never have been strong enough to carry the tray upstairs if she had not been assisted in private by her mistress, who now sat in state, pretending not to know what cakes were sent up, though she knew, and we knew, and she knew that we knew, and we knew that she knew that we knew she had been busy all the morning making tea bread and sponge cakes. There were one or two consequences arising from this general but unacknowledged poverty and this very much acknowledged gentility, which were not amiss and which might be introduced into many circles of society to their great improvement. For instance, the inhabitants of Cranford kept early hours and clattered home in their pattens under the guidance of a lantern-bearer about 9 o'clock at night, and the whole town was abed and asleep by 10:30. Moreover, it was considered vulgar, a tremendous word in Cranford, to give anything expensive in the way of eatable or drinkable at the evening entertainments. Wafer bread and butter and sponge biscuits were all that the Honourable Mrs. Jameson gave, and she was sister-in-law to the late Earl of Glenmire, although she did practice such elegant economy. Elegant economy? How naturally one falls back into the phraseology of Cranford. Their economy was always elegant and money-spending. Always vulgar and ostentatious, a sort of sour grapeism which made us very peaceful and satisfied. I never shall forget the dismay felt when a certain Captain Brown came to live at Cranford and openly spoke about his being poor, not in a whisper to an intimate friend, the doors and windows being previously closed, but in the public street. In a loud military voice, alleging his poverty as a reason for not taking a particular house. The ladies of Cranford were already rather moaning over the invasion of their territories by a man and a gentleman. He was a half-pay captain and had obtained some situation on a neighboring railroad which had been vehemently petitioned against by the little town, and if, in addition to his masculine gender and his connection with the obnoxious railroad, he was so brazen as to talk of being poor, why, then, indeed, he must be sent to Coventry. Death was as true and as common as poverty, yet people never spoke about that loud out in the streets. It was a word not to be mentioned to ears polite. We had tacitly agreed to ignore that any with whom we associated on terms of visiting equality could ever be prevented by poverty from doing anything that they wished. If we walked to or from a party, it was because the night was so fine or the air so refreshing, not because sedan chairs were expensive. If we wore prints instead of summer silks, it was because we preferred a washing material, and so on, till we blinded ourselves to the vulgar fact that we were, all of us, people of very moderate means. Of course, then, we did not know what to make of a man who could speak of poverty as if it was not a disgrace. Yet, somehow, Captain Brown made himself respected in Cranford and was called upon, in spite of all resolutions to the contrary. I was surprised to hear his opinions quoted as authority at a visit which I paid to Cranford about a year after he had settled in the town. My own friends had been among the bitterest opponents of any proposal to visit the captain and his daughters only 12 months before, and now he was even admitted in the tabooed hours before 12. True, it was to discover the cause of a smoking chimney before the fire was lighted. But still Captain Brown walked upstairs, nothing daunted, spoke in a voice too large for the room, and joked quite in the way of a tame man about the house. He had been blind to all the small slights and omissions of trivial ceremonies with which he had been received. He had been friendly, though the Cranford ladies had been cool. He had answered small sarcastic compliments in good faith, and with his manly frankness had overpowered all the shrinking which met him as a man who was not ashamed to be poor. And, at last, his excellent masculine common sense and his facility in devising expedients to overcome domestic Dilemmas had gained him an extraordinary place as authority among the Cranford ladies. He himself went on in his course, as unaware of his popularity as he had been of the reverse, and I am sure he was startled one day when he found his advice so highly esteemed as to make some counsel which he had given in jest to be taken in sober, serious earnest. It was on this subject. An old lady had an Alderney cow, which she looked upon as a daughter. You could not pay the short quarter of an hour call without being told of the wonderful wonderful intelligence of this animal. The whole town knew and kindly regarded Miss Betsy Barker's Alderney, therefore great was the sympathy and regret when, in an unguarded moment, the poor cow tumbled into a lime pit. She moaned so loudly that she was soon heard and rescued, but meanwhile the poor beast had lost most of her hair and came out looking naked, cold, and miserable, in a bare skin. Everybody pitied the animal, though a few could not restrain their smiles at her droll appearance. Miss Betsy Barker absolutely cried with sorrow and dismay. And it was said she thought of trying a bath of oil. This remedy, perhaps, was recommended by some one of the number whose advice she asked, but the proposal, if ever it was made, was knocked on the head by Captain Brown's decided "Get her a flannel waistcoat and flannel drawers, ma'am, if you wish to keep her alive. But my advice is, kill the poor creature at once." Miss Betsy Barker dried her eyes and thanked the captain heartily. She set to work, and by all the town turned out to see the Alderney meekly going to her pasture, clad in dark grey flannel. I have watched her myself many a time. Do you ever see cows dressed in grey flannel in London? Picture meekly going to her pasture. Captain Brown had taken a small house on the outskirts of the town where he lived with his 2 daughters. He must have been upwards of 60 at the time of the first visit I paid to Cranford after I had left it as a residence. But he had a wiry, well-trained, elastic figure, a stiff military throw back of his head, and a springing step, which made him appear much younger than he was. His eldest daughter looked almost as old as himself and betrayed the fact that his real was more than his apparent age. Miss Brown must have been 40, she had a sickly, pained, careworn expression on her face and looked as if the gaiety of youth had long faded out of sight. Even when young she must have been plain and hard-featured. Miss Jessie Brown was 10 years younger than her sister and 20 shades prettier. Her face was round and dimpled. Miss Jenkyns once said, in a passion against Captain Brown, the cause of which I will tell you presently, that she thought it was time for Miss Jessie to leave off her dimples and not always to be trying to look like a child. It was true there was something childlike in her face, and there will be, I think, till she dies, though she should live to 100. Her eyes were large blue wondering eyes, looking straight at you. Her nose was unformed and snub, and her lips were red and dewy. She wore her hair, too, in little rows of curls, which heightened this appearance. I do not know whether she was pretty or not, but I liked her face, and so did everybody, and I do not think she could help her dimples. She had something of her father's jauntiness of gait and manner, and any female observer might detect a slight difference in the attire of the 2 sisters, that of Miss Jessie being about £2 per annum more expensive than Miss Brown's. £2 was a large sum in Captain Brown's annual disbursements. Such was the impression made upon me by the Brown family when I first saw them all together in Cranford Church. The captain I had met before on the occasion of the smoky chimney, which he had cured by some simple alteration in the flue. In church, he held his double eyeglass to his eyes during the morning hymn and then lifted up his head erect and sang out loud and joyfully. He made the responses louder than the clerk, an old man with a piping feeble voice, who, I think, felt aggrieved at the captain's sonorous bass and quivered higher and higher. In consequence, on coming out of church, the brisk captain paid the most gallant attention to his 2 daughters. He nodded and smiled to his acquaintances, but he shook hands with none until he had helped Miss Brown to unfurl her umbrella, had relieved her of her prayer book, and had waited patiently till she, with trembling nervous hands, had taken up her gown to walk through the wet roads. I wonder what the Cranford ladies did with Captain Brown at their parties. We had often rejoiced, in former days, that there was no gentleman to be attended to and to find conversation for at the card parties. We had congratulated ourselves upon the snugness of the evenings, and, in our love for gentility and distaste of mankind, we had almost persuaded ourselves that to be a man was to be vulgar, so that when I found my friend and hostess, Miss Jenkyns, was going to have a party in my honor and that Captain and the Miss Browns were invited, I wondered much what would be the course of the evening. Card tables with green baize tops were set out by daylight, just as usual. It was the third week in November, so the evenings closed in about 4. Candles and clean packs of cards were arranged on each table. The fire was made up, the neat maidservant had received her last directions, and there we stood, dressed in our best, each with a candle lighter in our hands, ready to dart at the candles as soon as the first knock came. Parties in Cranford were solemn festivities, making the ladies feel gravely elated as they sat together in their best dresses. As soon as 3 had arrived, we sat down to preference, I being the unlucky 4th. The next 4 comers were put down immediately to another table, and presently the tea trays, which I had seen set out in the storeroom as I passed in the morning, were placed each on the middle of a card table. The china was delicate eggshell. The old-fashioned silver glittered with polishing, but the eatables were of the slightest description. While the trays were yet on the tables, Captain and the Miss Browns came in, and I could see that, somehow or other, the Captain was a favorite with all the ladies present. Ruffled brows were smoothed, sharp voices lowered at his approach. Miss Brown looked ill and depressed almost to gloom. Miss Jessie smiled as usual and seemed nearly as popular as her father. He immediately and quietly assumed the man's place in the room, attended to everyone's wants, lessened the pretty maid-servant's labor by waiting on empty cups and bread and butterless ladies, and yet did it all in so easy and dignified a manner, and so much as if it were a matter of course for the strong to attend to the weak, that he was a true man throughout. He played for threepenny points with as grave an interest as if they had been pounds. And yet, in all his attention to strangers, he had an eye on his suffering daughter, for suffering I was sure she was, though to many eyes she might only appear to be irritable. Miss Jessie could not play cards, but she talked to the sitters out, who, before her coming, had been rather inclined to be cross. She sang, too, to an old cracked piano, which I think had been a spinet in its youth. Miss Jessie sang Jock of Hazeldean a little out of tune, but we were none of us musical, though Miss Jenkyns beat time, out of time, by way of appearing to be so. It was very good of Miss Jenkyns to do this, for I had seen that, a little before, she had been a good deal annoyed by Miss Jessie Brown's unguarded admission apropos of Shetland wool that she had an uncle, her mother's brother, who was a shopkeeper in Edinburgh. Miss Jenkyns tried to drown this confession by a terrible cough, for the Honourable Mrs. Jameson was sitting at a card table nearest Miss Jessie, and what would she say or think if she found out she was in the same room with a shopkeeper's niece? But Miss Jessie Brown, who had no tact, as we all agreed the next morning, would repeat the information and assure Miss Pole she could easily get her the identical Shetland wool required through my uncle, who has the best assortment of Shetland goods of any one in Edinburgh. It was to take the taste of this out of our mouths and the sound of this out of our ears that Miss Jenkyns proposed music. So I say again, it was very good of her to beat time to the song. When the trays reappeared with biscuits and wine, punctually at 8:45, there was conversation, comparing of cards, and talking over tricks, but by and by Captain Brown sported a bit of literature. "Have you seen any numbers of the Pickwick papers?" said he. They were then publishing in parts. Capital thing. Now Miss Jenkyns was daughter of a deceased rector of Cranford and, on the strength of a number of manuscript sermons and a pretty good library of divinity, considered herself literary and looked upon any conversation about books as a challenge to her. So she answered and said, yes, she had seen them, indeed, she might say she had read them. "And what do you think of them?" exclaimed Captain Brown. "Aren't they famously good?" So urged Miss Jenkyns could not but speak. "I must say, I don't think they are by any means equal to Dr. Johnson. Still, perhaps, the author is young. Let him persevere, and who knows what he may become if he will take the great doctor for his model." This was evidently too much for Captain Brown to take placidly, and I saw the words on the tip of his tongue before Miss Jenkyns had finished. Her sentence. "It is quite a different sort of thing, my dear madam," he began. "I am quite aware of that," returned she. "And I make allowances. Captain Brown. Just allow me to read you a scene out of this month's number," pleaded he. "I had it only this morning, and I don't think the company can have read it yet." "As you please," said she, settling herself with an air of resignation. He read the account of the soiree which Sam Weller gave at Bath. Some of us laughed heartily. I did not dare, because I was staying in the house. Miss Jenkyns sat in patient gravity. When it was ended, she turned to me and said with mild dignity, "Fetch me Rosella's, my dear, out of the book room." When I had brought it to her, she turned to Captain Brown. "Now allow me to read you a scene, and then the present company can judge between your favorite, Mr. Boz, and Dr. Johnson." She read one of the conversations between Rosellas and Imlac in a high-pitched, majestic voice. And when she had ended, she said, "I imagine I am now justified in my preference of Dr. Johnson as a writer of fiction." The captain screwed his lips up and drummed on the table. But he did not speak. She thought she would give him a finishing blow or two. Picture. Endeavoring to beguile her into conversation. "I consider it vulgar and below the dignity of literature to publish in numbers." "How was the Rambler published, ma'am?" asked Captain Brown in a low voice, which I think Miss Jenkyns could not have heard. "Dr. Johnson's style is a model for young beginners. My father recommended it to me when I began to write letters. I have formed my own style upon it. I recommended it to your favorite. I should be very sorry for him to exchange his style for any such pompous writing," said Captain Brown. Miss Jenkyns felt this as a personal affront in a way of which the captain had not dreamed. Epistolary writing she and her friends considered as her forte. Many a copy of many a letter have I seen written and corrected on the slate before she seized the half-hour just previous to post time to assure her friends of this or of that. And Dr. Johnson was, as she said, her model in these compositions. She drew herself up with dignity and only replied to Captain Brown's last remark by saying, with marked emphasis on every syllable, "I prefer Drive Johnson to Mr. Boz." It is said I won't vouch for the fact that Captain Brown was heard to say, "Sotto vos, DN Dr. Johnson." If he did, he was penitent. Afterwards, as he showed by going to stand near Miss Jenkyns' armchair and endeavoring to beguile her into conversation on some more pleasing subject. But she was inexorable. The next day she made the remark I have mentioned about Miss Jessie's dimples. Chapter 2. The Captain. It was impossible to live a month at Cranford and not know the daily habits of each resident, and long before my visit was ended I knew much concerning the whole Brown trio. There was nothing new to be discovered respecting their poverty, for they had spoken simply and openly about that from the very first. They made no mystery of the necessity for their being economical. All that remained to be discovered was the captain's infinite kindness of heart and the various modes in which, unconsciously to himself, he manifested it. Some little anecdotes were talked about for some time after they occurred. As we did not read much, and as all the ladies were pretty well suited with servants, there was a dearth of subjects for conversation. We therefore discussed the circumstance of the captain taking a poor old woman's dinner out of her hands one very slippery Sunday. He had met her returning from the bakehouse as he came from church and noticed her precarious footing. And, with the grave dignity with which he did everything, he relieved her of her burden and steered along the street by her side, carrying her baked mutton and potatoes safely home. This was thought very eccentric, and it was rather expected that he would pay a round of calls on the Monday morning to explain and apologize to the Cranford sense of propriety. But he did no such thing. And then it was decided that he was ashamed and was keeping out of sight. And a kindly pity for him, we began to say, after all, the Sunday morning's occurrence showed great goodness of heart, and it was resolved that he should be comforted on his next appearance amongst us. But, lo! He came down upon us, untouched by any sense of shame, speaking loud and bass as ever, his head thrown back, his wig as jaunty and well curled as usual, and we were obliged to conclude he had forgotten all about Sunday. Miss Pole and Miss Jessie Brown had set up a kind of intimacy on the strength of the Shetland wool and the new knitting stitches, so it happened that when I went to visit Miss Pole I saw more of the Browns than I had done while staying with Miss Jenkyns, who had never got over what she called Captain Brown's disparaging remarks upon Dr. Johnson as a writer of light and agreeable fiction. I found that Miss Brown was seriously ill of some lingering, incurable complaint, the pain occasioned by which gave the uneasy expression to her face that I had taken for unmitigated crossness. Cross, too, she was at times when the nervous irritability occasioned by her disease became past endurance. Miss Jessie bore with her at these times even more patiently than she did with the bitter self-upbraidings by which they were invariably succeeded. Miss Brown used to accuse herself not merely of hasty and irritable temper but also of being the cause why her father and sister were obliged to pinch in order to allow her the small luxuries which were necessaries in her condition. She would so fain have made sacrifices for them and have lightened their cares that the original generosity of her disposition added acerbity to her temper. All this was borne by Miss Jessie and her father with more than placidity, with absolute tenderness. I forgave Miss Jessie her singing out of tune and her juvenility of dress when I saw her at home. I came to perceive that Captain Brown's dark Brutus wig and padded coat, alas, too often threadbare, were remnants of the military smartness of his youth, which he now wore unconsciously. He was a man of infinite resources, gained in his barrack experience. As he confessed, no one could black his boots to please him except himself, but, indeed, he was not above saving the little maid servant's labors in every way, knowing, most likely, that his daughter's illness made the place a hard one. He endeavored to make peace with Miss Jenkyns soon after the memorable dispute I have named by a present of a wooden fire shovel, his own making, having heard her say how much the grating of an iron one annoyed her. She received the present with cool gratitude and thanked him formally. When he was gone, she bade me put it away in the lumber room, feeling, probably, that no present from a man who preferred Mr. Boz to Dr. Johnson could be less jarring than an iron fire shovel. Such was the state of things when I left Cranford and went to Drumble. I had, however, several correspondents who kept me au fait as to the proceedings of the dear little town. There was Miss Pole, who was becoming as much absorbed in crochet as she had been once in knitting, and the burden of whose letter was something like, "But don't you forget the white worsted at Flint's" of the old song, for at the end of every sentence of news came a fresh direction as to some crochet commission which I was to execute for her. Miss Matilda Jenkyns, who did not mind being called Miss Matty when Miss Jenkyns was not by, wrote nice, kind, rambling letters, now and then venturing into an opinion of her own, but suddenly pulling herself up and either begging me not to name what she had said, as Deborah thought differently and she knew, or else putting in a postscript to the effect that, since writing the above, she had been talking over the subject with Deborah and was quite convinced that, etc. Here probably followed a recantation of every opinion she had given in the letter. Then came Miss Jenkyns, Deborah, as she liked Miss Matty to call her, her father having once said that the Hebrew name ought to be so pronounced. I secretly think she took the Hebrew prophetess for a model in character, and, indeed, she was not unlike the stern prophetess in some ways, making allowance, of course, for modern customs and difference in dress. Miss Jenkyns wore a cravat and a little bonnet like a jockey cap and altogether had the appearance of a strong-minded woman, although she would have despised the modern idea of women being equal to men. Equal, indeed. She knew they were superior. But to return to her letters. Everything in them was stately and grand. Like herself. I have been looking them over, dear Miss Jenkyns, how I honored her. And I will give an extract, more especially because it relates to our friend Captain Brown. The Honorable Mrs. Jameson has only just quitted me, and, in the course of conversation, she communicated to me the intelligence that she had yesterday received a call from her revered husband's quondam friend, Lord Mauleverer. You will not easily conjecture what brought his lordship within the precincts of our little town. It was to see Captain Brown, with whom, it appears, his lordship was acquainted in the plumed wars and who had the privilege of averting destruction from his lordship's head when some great peril was impending over it, off the misnomered Cape of Good Hope. You know our friend the Honorable Mrs. Jameson's deficiency in the spirit of innocent curiosity, and you will therefore not be so much surprised when I tell you she was quite unable to disclose to me the exact nature of the peril in question. I was anxious, I confess, to ascertain in what manner Captain Brown, with his limited establishment, could receive so distinguished a guest, and I discovered that his lordship retired to rest and, let us hope, to refreshing slumbers at the Angel Hotel, but shared the Brunonian meals during the 2 days that he honored Cranford with his august presence. Mrs. Johnson, our civil butcher's wife, informs me that Miss Jessie purchased a leg of lamb, but, besides this, I can hear of no preparation whatever to give a suitable reception to so distinguished a visitor. Perhaps they entertained him with the feast of reason and the flow of soul, and to us, who are acquainted with Captain Brown's sad want of relish for the pure wells of English undefiled, it may be matter for congratulation that he has had the opportunity of improving his taste by holding converse with an elegant and refined member of the British aristocracy. But from some mundane failings who is altogether free? Miss Pole and Miss Matty wrote to me by the same post. Such a piece of news as Lord Mauleverer's visit was not to be lost on the Cranford letter writers. They made the most of it. Miss Matty humbly apologized for writing at the same time as her sister, who was so much more capable than she to describe the honor done to Cranford, but in spite of a little bad spelling, Miss Matty's account gave me the best idea of the commotion occasioned by his lordship's visit after it had occurred. For, except the people at the Angel, the Browns, Mrs. Jameson, and a little lad his lordship had sworn at for driving a dirty hoop against the aristocratic legs, I could not hear of anyone with whom his lordship had held conversation. My next visit to Cranford was in the summer. There had been neither births, deaths, nor marriages since I was there last. Everybody lived in the same house and wore pretty nearly the same well-preserved, old-fashioned clothes. The greatest event was that Miss Jenkyns had purchased a new carpet for the drawing room. Oh, the busy work Miss Matty and I had in chasing the sunbeams as they fell in an afternoon. Right down on this carpet through the blindless window. We spread newspapers over the places and sat down to our book or our work, and lo! In a quarter of an hour the sun had moved and was blazing away on a fresh spot, and down again we went on our knees to alter the position of the newspapers. We were very busy, too, one whole morning before Miss Jenkyns gave her party, in following her directions and in cutting out and stitching together pieces of newspaper so as to form little paths to every chair set for the expected visitors, lest their shoes might dirty or defile the purity of the carpet. Do you make paper paths for every guest to walk upon in London? Captain Brown and Miss Jenkyns were not very cordial to each other. The literary dispute, of which I had seen the beginning, was a raw the slightest touch on which made them wince. It was the only difference of opinion they had ever had, but that difference was enough. Miss Jenkyns could not refrain from talking at Captain Brown, and, though he did not reply, he drummed with his fingers, which action she felt and resented as very disparaging to Dr. Johnson. He was rather ostentatious in his preference of the writings of Mr. Boz, would walk through the streets so absorbed in them that he all but ran against Miss Jenkyns, and though his apologies were earnest and sincere, and though he did not, in fact, do more than startle her and himself, she owned to me she had rather he had knocked her down if he had only been reading a higher style of literature. The poor, brave captain. He looked older and more worn. And his clothes were very threadbare. But he seemed as bright and cheerful as ever, unless he was asked about his daughter's health. She suffers a great deal, and she must suffer more. We do what we can to alleviate her pain. God's will be done. He took off his hat at these last words. I found from Miss Matty that everything had been done, in fact. A medical man of high repute in that country neighborhood had been sent for, and every injunction he had given was attended to, regardless of expense. Miss Matty was sure they denied themselves many things in order to make the invalid comfortable, but they never spoke about it. And as for Miss Jessie, I really think she's an angel, said poor Miss Matty, quite overcome to see her way of bearing with Miss Brown's crossness and the bright face she puts on after she's been sitting up a whole night and scolded above half of it is quite beautiful. Yet she looks as neat and as ready to welcome the captain at breakfast time as if she had been asleep in the Queen's bed all night. My dear, You could never laugh at her prim little curls or her pink bows again if you saw her as I have done. I could only feel very penitent and greet Miss Jessie with double respect when I met her. Next. She looked faded and pinched, and her lips began to quiver, as if she was very weak when she spoke of her sister. But she brightened and sent back the tears that were glittering in her pretty eyes as she said, "But, to be sure, what a town Cranford is for kindness. I don't suppose anyone has a better dinner than usual cooked, but the best part of all comes in a little covered basin for my sister. The poor people will leave their earliest vegetables at our door for her. They speak short and gruff, as if they were ashamed of it. But I am sure it often goes to my heart to see their thoughtfulness." The tears now came back and overflowed, but after a minute or two she began to scold herself and ended by going away the same cheerful Miss Jessie as ever. "But why does not this Lord Mauleverer do something for the man who saved his life?" said I. "Why, you see, unless Captain Brown has some reason for it, he never speaks about being poor," and he walked along by his lordship looking as happy and cheerful as a prince, and as they never called attention to their dinner by apologies, and as Miss Brown was better that day, and all seemed bright, I dare say his lordship never knew how much care there was in the background. He did send game in the winter pretty often, but now he is gone abroad. I had often occasion to notice the use that was made of fragments and small opportunities in Cranford, the rose leaves that were gathered ere they fell to make into a potpourri for someone who had no garden, the little bundles of lavender flowers sent to strew the drawers of some town dweller or to burn in the chamber of some invalid. Things that many would despise and actions which it seemed scarcely worthwhile to perform were all attended to in Cranford. Miss Jenkyns stuck an apple full of cloves to be heated and smell pleasantly in Miss Brown's room. And as she put in each clove she uttered a Johnsonian sentence. Indeed, she never could think of the Browns without talking Johnson, and, as they were seldom absent from her thoughts just then, I heard many a rolling, three-piled sentence. Captain Brown called one day to thank Miss Jenkyns for many little kindnesses, which I did not know until then that she had rendered. He had suddenly become like an old man, his deep bass voice had a quavering in it, his eyes looked dim, and the lines on his face were deep. He could not speak cheerfully of his daughter's state, but he talked with manly pious resignation, and not much. Twice over he said, "What Jessie has been to us, God only knows." And after the second time, he got up hastily, shook hands all round without speaking, and left the room. That afternoon we perceived little groups in the street, all listening with faces aghast to some tale or other. Miss Jenkyns wondered what could be the matter for some time before she took the undignified step of sending Jenny out to inquire. Jenny came back with a white face of terror. "Oh ma'am. Oh Miss Jenkyns, ma'am. Captain Brown is killed by them nasty cruel railroads." And she burst into tears. She, along with many others, had experienced the poor captain's kindness. How? Where? Good God. Jenny, don't waste time in crying, but tell us something. Miss Matty rushed out into the street at once and collared the man who was telling the tale. Picture. She brought the affrighted Carter into the drawing room. Come to my sister at once, Miss Jenkyns, the rector's daughter." "Oh, man. Say it is not true," she cried as she brought the affrighted Carter, sleeking down his hair, into the drawing room, where he stood with his wet boots on the new carpet and no one regarded it. "Please, mum, it is true. I seed it myself," and he shuddered at the recollection. The captain was a-reading some new book as he was deep in a-waiting for the down train, and there was a little lass as wanted to come to its mammy and gave its sister the slip and came toddling across the line. And he looked up sudden at the sound of the train coming and seed the child and he darted on the line and cotched it up. And his foot slipped and the train came over him in no time. Oh Lord. Mum, it's quite true, and they've come over to tell his daughters. The child's safe, though, with only a bang on its shoulder as he threw it to its mammy. Poor captain would be glad of that, mum. Wouldn't he? God bless him." The great rough Carter puckered up his manly face and turned away to hide his tears. I turned to Miss Jenkyns. She looked very ill, as if she were going to faint, and signed to me to open the window. "Matilda, bring me my bonnet. I must go to those girls. God pardon me if ever I have spoken contemptuously to the captain." Miss Jenkyns arrayed herself to go out, telling Miss Matilda to give the man a glass of wine. While she was away, Miss Matty and I huddled over the fire, talking in a low and awestruck voice. I know we cried quietly all the time. Miss Jenkyns came home in a silent mood, and we durst not ask her many questions. She told us that Miss Jessie had fainted and that she and Miss Pole had had some difficulty in bringing her round, but that, as soon as she recovered, she begged one of them to go and sit with her sister. "Mr. Hoggins says she cannot live many days, and she shall be spared this shock," said Miss Jessie, shivering with feelings to which she dared not give way. "But how can you manage, my dear?" asked Miss Jenkyns. "You cannot bear up, she must see your tears." "God will help me, I will not give way." She was asleep when the news came. She may be asleep yet. She would be so utterly miserable, not merely at my father's death, but to think of what would become of me. She is so good to me. She looked up earnestly in their faces with her soft true eyes, and Miss Pole told Miss Jenkyns afterwards she could hardly bear it, knowing, as she did, how Miss Brown treated her sister. However, it was settled according to Miss Jessie's wish. Miss Brown was to be told her father had been summoned to take a short journey on railway business. They had managed it in some way, Miss Jenkyns could not exactly say how. Miss Pole was to stop with Miss Jessie. Mrs. Jameson had sent to inquire. And this was all we heard that night, and a sorrowful night it was. The next day a full account of the fatal accident was in the county paper, which Miss Jenkyns took in. Her eyes were very weak, she said, and she asked me to read it. When I came to, the gallant gentleman was deeply engaged in the perusal of a number of Pickwick which he had just received. Miss Jenkyns shook her head long and solemnly and then sighed out, "Poor, dear, infatuated man." The corpse was to be taken from the station to the parish church, there to be interred. Miss Jessie had set her heart on following it to the grave, and no dissuasives could alter her resolve. Her restraint upon herself made her almost obstinate. She resisted all Miss Pole's entreaties and Miss Jenkyns' advice. At last Miss Jenkyns gave up the point, and after a silence, which I feared portended some deep displeasure against Miss Jessie, Miss Jenkyns said she should accompany the latter to the funeral. "It is not fit for you to go alone. It would be against both propriety and humanity were I to allow it." Miss Jessie seemed as if she did not half like this arrangement, but her obstinacy, if she had any, had been exhausted in her determination to go to the interment. She longed, poor thing, I have no doubt, to cry alone over the grave of the dear father to whom she had been all in all, and to give way, for one little half hour, uninterrupted by sympathy and unobserved by friendship. But it was not to be. That afternoon Miss Jenkyns sent out for a yard of black crape and employed herself busily in trimming the little black silk bonnet I have spoken about. When it was finished she put it on and looked at us for admiration. She despised. I was full of sorrow, but by one of those whimsical thoughts which come unbidden into our heads in times of deepest grief. I no sooner saw the bonnet than I was reminded of a helmet, and in that hybrid bonnet, half helmet, half jockey cap, did Miss Jenkyns attend Captain Brown's funeral and, I believe, supported Miss Jessie with a tender, indulgent firmness which was invaluable, allowing her to weep her passionate fill before they left. Miss Pole, Miss Matty, and I, meanwhile attended to Miss Brown. And hard work we found it to relieve her querulous and never-ending complaints. But if we were so weary and dispirited, what must Miss Jessie have been? Yet she came back almost calm, as if she had gained a new strength. She put off her morning dress and came in, looking pale and gentle, thanking us each with a soft long pressure of the hand. She could even smile a faint, sweet, wintry smile as if to reassure us of her power to endure, but her look made our eyes fill suddenly with tears, more than if she had cried outright. It was settled that Miss Pole was to remain with her all the watching livelong night, and that Miss Matty and I were to return in the morning to relieve them and give Miss Jessie the opportunity for a few hours of sleep. But when the morning came, Miss Jenkyns appeared at the breakfast table, equipped in her helmet bonnet, and ordered Miss Matty To stay at home, as she meant to go and help to nurse. She was evidently in a state of great friendly excitement, which she showed by eating her breakfast standing and scolding the household all round. No nursing, no energetic, strong-minded woman could help Miss Brown now. There was that in the room as we entered which was stronger than us all and made us shrink into solemn awestruck helplessness. Miss Brown was dying. We hardly knew her voice, it was so devoid of the complaining tone we had always associated with it. Miss Jessie told me afterwards that it, and her face too, were just what they had been formerly when her mother's death left her the young anxious head of the family, of whom only Miss Jessie survived. She was conscious of her sister's presence, though not, I think, of ours. We stood a little behind the curtain. Miss Jessie knelt with her face near her sister's in order to catch the last soft awful whispers. "Oh Jessie. Jessie. How selfish I have been. God forgive me for letting you sacrifice yourself for me as you did. I have so loved you and yet I have thought only of myself. God forgive me." "Hush, love. Hush," said Miss Jessie, sobbing. "And my father, my dear, dear father. I will not complain now, if God will give me strength to be patient. But, oh Jessie, tell my father how I longed and yearned to see him at last and to ask his forgiveness. He can never know now how I loved him. Oh, if I might but tell him before I die. What a life of sorrow his has been, and I have done so little to cheer him." The light came into Miss Jessie's face. "Would it comfort you, dearest, to think that he does know? Would it comfort you, love, to know that his cares, his sorrows?" Her voice quivered, but she steadied it into calmness. "Mary. He has gone before you to the place where the weary are at rest. He knows now how you loved him." A strange look, which was not distress, came over Miss Brown's face. She did not speak for some time, but then we saw her lips form the words rather than heard the sound "Father, Mother, Harry, Archie," then, as if it were a new idea throwing a filmy shadow over her darkened mind. "But you will be alone, Jessie." Miss Jessie had been feeling this all during the silence, I think, for the tears rolled down her cheeks like rain at these words, and she could not answer at first. Then she put her hands together tight and lifted them up and said, "But not to us, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." In a few moments more Miss Brown lay calm and still, never to sorrow or murmur more. After the second funeral, Miss Jenkyns insisted that Miss Jessie should come to stay with her rather than go back to the desolate house, which, in fact, we learned from Miss Jessie, must now be given up as she had not wherewithal to maintain it. She had something above £20 a year, besides the interest of the money for which the furniture would sell, but she could not live upon that. And so we talked over her qualifications for earning money. "I can sew neatly," said she, "and I like nursing. I think, too, I could manage a house if anyone would try me as housekeeper, or I would go into a shop as saleswoman if they would have patience with me at first." Miss Jenkyns declared in an angry voice that she should do no such thing and talked to herself about some people having no idea of their rank as a captain's daughter. Nearly an hour afterwards, when she brought Miss Jessie up a basin of delicately made arrowroot and stood over her like a dragoon until the last spoonful was finished. Then she disappeared. Miss Jessie began to tell me some more of the plans which had suggested themselves to her and insensibly fell into talking of the days that were past and gone and interested me so much I neither knew nor heeded how time passed. We were both startled when Miss Jenkyns reappeared and caught us crying. I was afraid lest she would be displeased, as she often said that crying hindered digestion, and I knew she wanted Miss Jessie to get strong, but instead, she looked queer and excited and fidgeted round us without saying anything. At last she spoke. "I have been so much startled." "No, I've not been at all startled, don't mind me, my dear Miss Jessie. I've been very much surprised. In fact, I've had a caller whom you knew once, my dear Miss Jessie." Miss Jessie went very white, then flushed scarlet and looked eagerly at Miss Jenkyns. "A gentleman, my dear, who wants to know if you would see him." "Is it? It is not," stammered out Miss Jessie and got no farther. "This is his card," said Miss Jenkyns, giving it to Miss Jessie, and while her head was bent over it, Miss Jenkyns went through a series of winks and odd faces to me and formed her lips into a long sentence of Which, of course, I could not understand a word. "May he come up?" asked Miss Jenkyns at last. "Oh, yes. Certainly," said Miss Jessie, as much as to say, "This is your house, you may show any visitor where you like." She took up some knitting of Miss Matty's and began to be very busy, though I could see how she trembled all over. Miss Jenkyns rang the bell and told the servant who answered it to show Major Gordon upstairs, and, presently, in walked a tall, fine, frank-looking man of 40 or upwards. He shook hands with Miss Jessie. But he could not see her eyes, she kept them so fixed on the ground. Miss Jenkyns asked me if I would come and help her to tie up the preserves in the store-room, and though Miss Jessie plucked at my gown and even looked up at me with begging eye, I durst not refuse to go where Miss Jenkyns asked. Instead of tying up preserves in the store-room, however, we went to talk in the dining-room, and there Miss Jenkyns told me what Major Gordon had told her, how he had served in the same regiment with Captain Brown and had become acquainted with Miss Jessie, then a sweet-looking, blooming girl of 18, how the acquaintance had grown into love on his part, though it had been some years before he had spoken, how, on becoming possessed, through the will of an uncle, of a good estate in Scotland, he had offered and been refused, though with so much agitation and evident distress that he was sure she was not indifferent to him, and how he had discovered that the obstacle was the fell disease which was, even then, too surely threatening her sister. She had mentioned that the surgeons foretold intense suffering, and there was no one but herself to nurse her poor Mary or cheer and comfort her father during the time of illness. They had had long discussions, and on her refusal to pledge herself to him as his wife when all should be over, he had grown angry and broken off entirely and gone abroad, believing that she was a cold-hearted person whom he would do well to forget. He had been traveling in the East and was on his return home when, at Rome, he saw the account of Captain Brown's death in Galignani. Just then Miss Matty, who had been out all the morning and had only lately returned to the house, burst in with a face of dismay and outraged propriety. "Oh, goodness me," she said. "Deborah, there's a gentleman sitting in the drawing-room with his arm round Miss Jessie's waist." Miss Matty's eyes looked large with terror. "Picture? With his arm around Miss Jessie's waist?" Miss Jenkyns snubbed her down in an instant. "The most proper place in the world for his arm to be in. Go away, Matilda, and mind your own business." This from her sister, who had hitherto been a model of feminine decorum, was a blow for poor Miss Matty, and with a double shock she left the room. The last time I ever saw poor Miss Jenkyns was many years after this. Mrs. Gordon had kept up a warm and affectionate intercourse with all at Cranford. Miss Jenkyns, Miss Matty, and Miss Pole had all been to visit her and returned with wonderful accounts of her house, her husband, her dress, and her looks. For, with happiness, something of her early bloom returned. She had been a year or two younger than we had taken her for. Her eyes were always lovely, and, as Mrs. Gordon, her dimples were not out of place. At the time to which I have referred, when I last saw Miss Jenkyns, that lady was old and feeble and had lost something of her strong mind. Little Flora Gordon was staying with the Misses Jenkyns, and when I came in she was reading aloud to Miss Jenkyns, who lay feeble and changed on the sofa. Flora put down the Rambler when I came in. "Ah," said Miss Jenkyns, "you find me changed, my dear. I can't see as I used to do. If Flora were not here to read to me, I hardly know how I should get through the day. Did you ever read the Rambler? It's a wonderful book, wonderful. And the most improving reading for Flora. Which I dare say it would have been if she could have read half the words without spelling and could have understood the meaning of a third better than that strange old book with the queer name. Poor Captain Brown was killed for reading that book by Mr. Boz, you know, old Paz, when I was a girl, but that's a long time ago. I acted Lucy in old Paz." She babbled on long enough for Flora to get a good long spell at the Christmas Carol which Miss Matty had left on the table. Chapter 3. A love affair of long ago. I thought that probably my connection with Cranford would cease after Miss Jenkyns' death, at least, that it would have to be kept up by correspondence, which bears much the same relation to personal intercourse that the books of dried plants I sometimes see, hortus siccus I think they call the thing, due to the living and fresh flowers in the lanes and meadows. I was pleasantly surprised, therefore, by receiving a letter from Miss Pole, who had always come in for a supplementary week after my annual visit to Miss Jenkyns, proposing that I should go and stay with her, and then, in a couple of days after my acceptance, came a note from Miss Matty, in which, in a rather circuitous and very humble manner, she told me how much pleasure I should confer if I could spend a week or two with her, either before or after I had been at Miss Pole's, for she said, since my dear sister's death I am well aware I have no attractions to offer, it is only to the kindness of my friends that I can owe their company. Of course I promised to come to dear Miss Matty as soon as I had ended my visit to Miss Pole, and the day after my arrival at Cranford I went to see her, much wondering what the house would be like without Miss Jenkyns, and rather dreading the changed aspect of things. Miss Matty began to cry as soon as she saw me. She was evidently nervous from having anticipated my call. I comforted her as well as I could, and I found the best consolation I could give was the honest praise that came from my heart as I spoke of the deceased. Miss Matty slowly shook her head over each virtue as it was named and attributed to her sister, and at last she could not restrain the tears which had long been silently flowing, but hid her face behind her handkerchief and sobbed aloud. Dear Miss Matty, said I, taking her hand, for indeed I did not know in what way to tell her how sorry I was for her, left deserted in the world. She put down her handkerchief and said, my dear, I'd rather you did not call me Matty. She did not like it. But I did many a thing she did not like, I'm afraid, and now she's gone. If you please, my love, will you call me Matilda? I promised faithfully and began to practice the new name with Miss Pole that very day, and, by degrees, Miss Matilda's feeling on the subject was known through Cranford, and we all tried to drop the more familiar name, but with so little success that by and by we gave up the attempt. My visit to Miss Pole was very quiet. Miss Jenkyns had so long taken the lead in Cranford that now she was gone, they hardly knew how to give a party. The Honourable Mrs. Jameson, to whom Miss Jenkyns herself had always yielded the post of honour, was fat and inert and very much at the mercy of her old servants. If they chose that she should give a party, they reminded her of the necessity for so doing. If not, she let it alone. There was all the more time for me to hear old-world stories from Miss Pole while she sat knitting and I making my father's shirts. I always took a quantity of plain sewing to Cranford, for, as we did not read much or walk much, I found it a capital time to get through my work. One of Miss Pole's stories related to a shadow of a love affair that was dimly perceived or suspected long years before. Presently, the time arrived when I was to remove to Miss Matilda's house. I found her timid and anxious about the arrangements for my comfort. Many a time, while I was unpacking, did she come backwards and forwards to stir the fire, which burned all the worse for being so frequently poked. Have you drawers enough, dear? Asked she. I don't know exactly how. My sister used to arrange them. She had capital methods. I am sure she would have trained a servant in a week to make a better fire than this. And Fanny has been with me 4 months. This subject of servants was a standing grievance, and I could not wonder much at it, for if gentlemen were scarce and almost unheard of in the genteel society of Cranford, they or their counterparts, handsome young men, abounded in the lower classes. The pretty neat servant maids had their choice of desirable followers, and their mistresses, without having the sort of mysterious dread of men and matrimony that Miss Matilda had, might well feel a little anxious lest the heads of their comely maids should be turned by the joiner or the butcher or the gardener, who were obliged, by their callings, to come to the house and who, as ill luck would have it, were generally handsome and unmarried. Fanny's lovers, if she had any, and Miss Matilda suspected her of so many flirtations that, if she had not been very pretty, I should have doubted her having one, were a constant anxiety to her mistress. She was forbidden, by the articles of her engagement, to have followers, and though she had answered, innocently enough, doubling up the hem of her apron as she spoke, please, ma'am, I never had more than one at a time, Miss Matty prohibited that one. But a vision of a man seemed to haunt the kitchen. Fanny assured me that it was all fancy, or else I should have said myself that I had seen a man's coat-tails whisk into the scullery once when I went on an errand into the storeroom at night, and another evening when, our watches having Stopped, I went to look at the clock. There was a very odd appearance. Singularly like a young man squeezed up between the clock and the back of the open kitchen door. And I thought Fanny snatched up the candle very hastily so as to throw the shadow on the clock face while she very positively told me the time half an hour too early, as we found out afterwards by the church clock. But I did not add to Miss Matty's anxieties by naming my suspicions, especially as Fanny said to me the next day that it was such a queer kitchen for having odd shadows about it. She really was almost afraid to stay, for you know, Miss, she added, I don't see a creature from 6 o'clock tea till Mrs. rings the bell for prayers at 10. However, it so fell out that Fanny had to leave and Miss Matilda begged me to stay and settle her with the new maid, to which I consented. After I had heard from my father that he did not want me at home. The new servant was a rough, honest-looking country girl who had only lived in a farm place before, but I liked her looks when she came to be hired, and I promised Miss Matilda to put her in the ways of the house. The said ways were religiously such as Miss Matilda thought her sister would approve. Many a domestic rule and regulation had been a subject of plaintive whispered murmur to me during Miss Jenkyns' life, but now that she was gone, I do not think that even I, who was a favorite, durst have suggested an alteration. To give an instance, we constantly adhered to the forms which were observed at meal times in my father the rector's house. Accordingly, we had always wine and dessert, but the decanters were only filled when there was a party, and what remained was seldom touched, though we had 2 wine glasses apiece every day after dinner until the next festive occasion arrived, when the state of the remainder wine was examined into in a family council. The dregs were often given to the poor, but occasionally, when a good deal had been left at the last party 5 months ago, it might be, it was added to some of a fresh bottle brought up from the cellar. I fancy poor Captain Brown did not much like wine, for I noticed he never finished his first glass, and most military men take several. Then, as to our dessert, Miss Jenkyns used to gather currants and gooseberries for it herself, which I sometimes thought would have tasted better fresh from the trees, but then, as Miss Jenkyns observed, there would have been nothing for dessert in summer time. As it was, we felt very genteel with our 2 glasses apiece and a dish of gooseberries at the top, of currants and biscuits at the sides, and 2 decanters at the bottom. When oranges came in, a curious proceeding was gone through. Miss Jenkyns did not like to cut the fruit, for, as she observed, the juice all ran out nobody knew where, sucking, only I think she used some more recondite word, was in fact the only way of enjoying oranges, but then there was the unpleasant association with a ceremony frequently gone through by little babies, and so, after dessert, in orange season Miss Jenkyns and Miss Matty used to rise up, possess themselves each of an orange in silence, and withdraw to the privacy of their own rooms to indulge in sucking oranges. I had once or twice tried, on such occasions, to prevail on Miss Matty to stay, and had succeeded in her sister's lifetime. I held up a screen and did not look, and, as she said, she tried not to make the noise very offensive, but now that she was left alone, she seemed quite horrified when I begged her to remain with me in the warm dining parlor and enjoy her orange as she liked best. And so it was. In everything, Miss Jenkyns' rules were made more stringent than ever because the framer of them was gone where there could be no appeal. In all things else Miss Matilda was meek and undecided to a fault. I have heard Fanny turn her round 20 times in a morning about dinner, just as the little hussy chose, and I sometimes fancied she worked on Miss Matilda's weakness in order to bewilder her and to make her feel more in the power of her clever servant. I determined that I would not leave her till I had seen what sort of a person Martha was, and, if I found her trustworthy, I would tell her not to trouble her mistress with every little decision. Martha was blunt and plain-spoken to a fault, otherwise she was a brisk, well-meaning, but very ignorant girl. She had not been with us a week before Miss Matilda and I were astounded one morning by the receipt of a letter from a cousin of hers who had been 20 or 30 years in India and who had lately, as we had seen by the army list, returned to England, bringing with him an invalid wife who had never been introduced to her English relations. Major Jenkyns wrote to propose That he and his wife should spend a night at Cranford on his way to Scotland at the inn if it did not suit Miss Matilda to receive them into her house, in which case they should hope to be with her as much as possible during the day. Of course it must suit her, as she said, for all Cranford knew that she had her sister's bedroom at liberty, but I am sure she wished the Major had stopped in India and forgotten his cousins. Out and out. Oh. How must I manage? Asked she helplessly. If Deborah had been alive she would have known what to do with a gentleman visitor. Must I put razors in his dressing room? Dear. And I've got none. Deborah would have had them. And slippers and coat brushes? I suggested that probably he would bring all these things with him. And after dinner, how am I to know when to get up and leave him to his wine? Deborah would have done it so well, she would have been quite in her element. Will he want coffee, do you think? I undertook the management of the coffee and told her I would instruct Martha in the art of waiting, in which it must be owned she was terribly deficient, and that I had no doubt Major and Mrs. Jenkyns would understand the quiet mode in which a lady lived by herself in a country town. But she was sadly fluttered. I made her empty her decanters and bring up 2 fresh bottles of wine. I wished I could have prevented her from being present at my instructions to Martha, for she frequently cut in with some fresh direction, muddling the poor girl's mind as she stood open-mouthed, listening to us both. Hand the vegetables round, said I, foolishly, I see now, for it was aiming at more than we could accomplish with quietness and simplicity. And then, seeing her look bewildered, I added, take the vegetables round to people and let them help themselves. And mind you go first to the ladies, put in Miss Matilda. Always go to the ladies before gentlemen when you are waiting. I'll do it as you tell me, ma'am, said Martha, but I like lads best. We felt very uncomfortable and shocked at this speech of Martha's, yet I don't think she meant any harm, and, on the whole, she attended very well to our directions, except that she nudged the Major when he did not help himself as soon as she expected to the potatoes while she was handing them round. The Major and his wife were quiet, unpretending people enough when they did come, languid, as all East Indians are, I suppose. We were rather dismayed at their bringing 2 servants with them, a Hindu body servant for the Major and a steady elderly maid for his wife, but they slept at the inn and took off a good deal of the responsibility by attending carefully to their masters' and mistresses' comfort. Martha, to be sure, had never ended her staring at the East Indian's white turban and brown complexion, and I saw that Miss Matilda shrunk away from him a little as he waited at dinner. Indeed, she asked me, when they were gone, if he did not remind me of Bluebeard. On the whole, the visit was most satisfactory and is a subject of conversation even now with Miss Matilda. At the time it greatly excited Cranford and even stirred up the apathetic and honorable Mrs. Jameson to some expression of interest when I went to call and thank her for the kind answers she had vouchsafed to Miss Matilda's inquiries as to the arrangement of a gentleman's dressing room, answers which I must confess she had given in the wearied manner of the Scandinavian prophetess. Leave me to repose. And now I come to the love affair. It seems that Miss Pole had a cousin, once or twice removed, who had offered to Miss Matty long ago. Now this cousin lived 4 or 5 miles from Cranford on his own estate, but his property was not large enough to entitle him to rank higher than a yeoman, or rather, with something of the pride which apes humility, he had refused to push himself on, as so many of his class had done, into the ranks of the squires. He would not allow himself to be called Thomas Holbrook, Esquire. He even sent back letters with this address, telling the postmistress at Cranford that his name was Mr. Thomas Holbrook, yeoman. He rejected all domestic innovations. He would have the house doors stand open in summer and shut in winter, without knocker or bell to summon a servant. The closed fist or the knob of a stick did this office for him if he found the door locked. He despised every refinement which had not its root deep down in humanity. If people were not ill, he saw no necessity for moderating his voice. He spoke the dialect of the country in perfection and constantly used it in conversation, although Miss Pole, who gave me these particulars, added that he read aloud more beautifully and with more feeling than anyone she had ever heard, except the late rector. And how came Miss Matilda not to marry him? Asked I. Oh, I don't know. She was willing enough, I think, but you know cousin Thomas would not have been enough of a gentleman for the rector and Miss Jenkyns. Well. But they were not to marry him, said I, impatiently. No, but they did not like Miss Matty to marry below her rank. You know. She was the rector's daughter, and somehow they are related to Sir Peter. Arley? Miss Jenkyns thought a deal of that. Poor Miss Matty, said I. Nay, now, I don't know anything more than that he offered and was refused. Miss Matty might not like him and Miss Jenkyns might never have said a word. It is only a guess of mine. Has she never seen him since? I inquired. No, I think not. You see, Woodley, cousin Thomas's house, lies halfway between Cranford and Miss Selton, and I know he made Miss Selton his market town very soon after he had offered to Miss Matty, and I don't think he has been into Cranford above once or twice since once, when I was walking with Miss Matty in High Street, and suddenly she darted from me and went up Shire Lane. A few minutes after I was startled by meeting cousin Thomas. How old is he? I asked, after a pause of castle building. He must be about 70, I think, my dear, said Miss Pole, blowing up my castle, as if by gunpowder, into small fragments. Very soon after, at least during my long visit to Miss Matilda, I had the opportunity of seeing Mr. Holbrook, seeing, too, his first encounter with his former love after 30 or 40 years' separation. I was helping to decide whether any of the new assortment of colored silks which they had just received at the shop would do to match a grey and black mousseline delaine that wanted a new breadth, when a tall, thin Don Quixote-looking old man came into the shop for some woolen gloves. I had never seen the person, who was rather striking, before, and I watched him rather attentively while Miss Matty listened to the shopman. The stranger wore a blue coat with brass buttons, drab breeches, and gaiters, and drummed with his fingers on the counter until he was attended to. When he answered the shop boy's question, "What can I have the pleasure of showing you today, sir?" I saw Miss Matilda start and then suddenly sit down, and instantly I guessed who it was. She had made some inquiry which had to be carried round to the other shopman. Miss Jenkyns wants the black sarcenet 2 and 2 the yard, and Mr. Holbrook had caught the name and was across the shop in 2 strides. Matty, Miss Matilda, Miss Jenkyns. God bless my soul. I should not have known you. How are you? How are you? He kept shaking her hand in a way which proved the warmth of his friendship, but he repeated so often, as if to himself, I should not have known you, that any sentimental romance which I might be inclined to build was quite done away with by his manner. However, he kept talking to us all the time we were in the shop, and then waving the shopman with the unpurchased gloves on one side, with another time, sir, another time. He walked home with us. I am happy to say my client, Miss Matilda, also left the shop in an equally bewildered state, not having purchased either green or red silk. Mr. Holbrook was evidently full with honest, loud-spoken joy at meeting his old love again. He touched on the changes that had taken place. He even spoke of Miss Jenkyns as your poor sister. Well, well. We have all our faults, and bade us goodbye with many a hope that he should soon see Miss Matty again. She went straight to her room and never came back till our early tea time, when I thought she looked as if she had been crying. Picture. Mr. Holbrook bade us goodbye. Chapter 4. A visit to an old bachelor. A few days after, a note came from Mr. Holbrook asking us impartially, asking both of us in a formal, old-fashioned style, to spend a day at his house, a long June day, for it was June now. He named that he had also invited his cousin, Miss Pole, so that we might join in a fly which could be put up at his house. I expected Miss Matty to jump at this invitation, but no, Miss Pole. And I had the greatest difficulty in persuading her to go. She thought it was improper and was even half annoyed when we utterly ignored the idea of any impropriety in her going with 2 other ladies to see her old lover. Then came a more serious difficulty. She did not think Deborah would have liked her to go. This took us half a day's good hard talking to get over, but at the first sentence of relenting, I seized the opportunity and wrote and dispatched an acceptance in her name, fixing day and hour that all might be decided and done with. The next morning she asked me if I would go down to the shop with her. And there, after much hesitation, we chose out 3 caps to be sent. home and tried on, that the most becoming might be selected to take with us on Thursday. She was in a state of silent agitation all the way to Woodley. She had evidently never been there before, and, although she little dreamt I knew anything of her early story, I could perceive she was in a tremor at the thought of seeing the place which might have been her home, and round which it is probable that many of her innocent girlish imaginations had clustered. It was a long drive there, through paved, jolting lanes. Miss Matilda sat bolt upright and looked wistfully out of the windows as we drew near the end of our journey. The aspect of the country was quiet and pastoral. Woodley stood among fields, and there was an old-fashioned garden where roses and currant bushes touched each other and where the feathery asparagus formed a pretty background to the pinks and gilly flowers. There was no drive up to the door. We got out at a little gate and walked up a straight box-edged path. "My cousin might make a drive, I think," said Miss Pole, who was afraid of earache and had only her cap on. "I think it is very pretty," said Miss Matty, with a soft plaintiveness in her voice and almost in a whisper, for just then Mr. Holbrook appeared at the door, rubbing his hands in very effervescence of hospitality. He looked more like my idea of Don Quixote than ever, and yet the likeness was only external. His respectable housekeeper stood modestly at the door to bid us welcome, and, while she led the elder ladies upstairs to a bedroom, I begged to look about the garden. My request evidently pleased the old gentleman, who took me all round the place and showed me his 26 cows, named after the different letters of the alphabet. As we went along, he surprised me occasionally by repeating apt and beautiful quotations from the poets, ranging easily from Shakespeare and George Herbert to those of our own day. He did this as naturally as if he were thinking aloud, and their true and beautiful words were the best expression he could find for what he was thinking or feeling. To be sure, he called Byron my Lord Byron and pronounced the name of Goethe strictly in accordance with the English sound of the letters, as Goethe says, "Ye ever vert in palaces and see." Altogether, I never met with a man, before or since, who had spent so long a life in a secluded and not impressive country, with ever-increasing delight in the daily and yearly change of season and beauty. When he and I went in, we found that dinner was nearly ready in the kitchen, for so I suppose the room ought to be called, as there were oak dressers and cupboards all round, all over by the side of the fireplace, and only a small Turkey carpet in the middle of the flag floor. The room might have been easily made into a handsome dark oak dining parlor by removing the oven and a few other appurtenances of a kitchen, which were evidently never used, the real cooking place being at some distance. The room in which we were expected to sit was a stiffly furnished, ugly apartment, but that in which we did sit was what Mr. Holbrook called the counting house, where he paid his laborers their weekly wages at a great desk near the door. The rest of the pretty sitting room, looking into the orchard and all covered over with dancing tree shadows, was filled with books. They lay on the ground, they covered the walls, they strewed the table. He was evidently half ashamed and half proud of his extravagance in this respect. They were of all kinds, poetry and wild weird tales prevailing. He evidently chose his books in accordance with his own tastes, not because such and such were classical or established favorites. "Ah," he said, "we farmers ought not to have much time for reading, yet somehow one can't help it." "What a pretty room," said Miss Matty, sotto voce. "What a pleasant place," said I, aloud, almost simultaneously. "Nay, if you like it," replied he, "but can you sit on these great black leather three-cornered chairs? I like it better than the best parlor, but I thought ladies would take that for the smarter place." It was the smarter place, but, like most smart things, not at all pretty, or pleasant, or home-like, so, while we were at dinner, the servant girl dusted and scrubbed the counting house chairs, and we sat there all the rest of the day. We had pudding before meat, and I thought Mr. Holbrook was going to make some apology for his old-fashioned ways, for he began, "I don't know whether you like newfangled ways." "Oh, not at all," said Miss Matty. "No more do I," said he. "My housekeeper will have these in her new fashion, or else I tell her that, when I was a young man, we used to keep strictly to my father's rule, no broth, no no beef, and always began dinner with broth. Then we had suet puddings boiled in the broth with the beef. and then the meat itself. If we did not sup our broth, we had no ball, which we liked a deal better, and the beef came last of all, and only those had it who had done justice to the broth and the ball. Now folks begin with sweet things and turn their dinners topsy-turvy. When the ducks and green peas came, we looked at each other in dismay. We had only two-pronged, black-handled forks. It is true the steel was as bright as silver, but what were we to do? Miss Matty picked up her peas, one by one, on the point of the prongs, much as a mine ate her grains of rice after her previous feast with the ghoul. Miss Pole sighed over her delicate young peas as she left them on one side of her plate untasted, for they would drop between the prongs. I looked at my host. The peas were going wholesale into his capacious mouth, shoveled up by his large round-ended knife. I imitated, I survived. My friends, in spite of my precedent, could not muster up courage enough to do an ungenteel thing, and, if Mr. Holbrook had not been so heartily hungry, he would probably have seen that the good peas went away almost untouched. After dinner, a clay pipe was brought in, and a spittoon, and, asking us to retire to another room, where he would soon join us if we disliked tobacco smoke, he presented his pipe to Miss Matty and requested her to fill the bowl. This was a compliment to a lady in his youth, but it was rather inappropriate to propose it as an honor to Miss Matty, who had been trained by her sister to hold smoking of every kind in utter abhorrence. But if it was a shock to her refinement, it was also a gratification to her feelings to be thus selected, so she daintily stuffed the strong tobacco into the pipe, and then we withdrew. "It is very pleasant dining with a bachelor," said Miss Matty softly, as we settled ourselves in the counting house. "I only hope it is not improper, so many pleasant things are." "What a number of books he has," said Miss Pole, looking round the room. "And how dusty they are." "I think it must be like one of the great Dr. Johnson's rooms," said Miss Matty. "What a superior man your cousin must be." "Yes," said Miss Pole, "he's a great reader, but I am afraid he has got into very uncouth habits with living alone." "Oh, uncouth is too hard a word. I should call him eccentric, very. Clever people always are," replied Miss Matty. Picture. Now, what color are ash buds in March? When Mr. Holbrook returned, he proposed a walk in the fields, but the two elder ladies were afraid of damp and dirt and had only very unbecoming calashes to put on over their caps, so they declined, and I was again his companion in a turn which he said he was obliged to take to see after his men. He strode along, either wholly forgetting my existence or soothed into silence by his pipe-pan, yet it was not silence exactly. He walked before me with a stooping gait, his hands clasped behind him. And, as some tree or cloud or glimpse of distant upland pastures struck him, he quoted poetry to himself, saying it out loud in a grand, sonorous voice, with just the emphasis that true feeling and appreciation give. We came upon an old cedar tree, which stood at one end of the house. The cedar spreads his dark green layers of shade. Capital term layers. Wonderful man. I did not know whether he was speaking to me or not, but I put in an assenting wonderful, although I knew nothing about it, just because I was tired of being forgotten and of being consequently silent. He turned sharp round. "Hey. You may say wonderful. Why, when I saw the review of his poems in Blackwood, I set off within an hour and walked 7 miles to Miss Selton, for the horses were not in the way, and ordered them. Now, what color are ash buds in March? Is the man going mad? Thought I. He is very like Don Quixote. What color are they, I say?" repeated he vehemently. "I am sure I don't know, sir," said I, with the meekness of ignorance. "I knew you didn't. No more did I, an old fool that I am. Till this young man comes and tells me. Black as ash buds in March. And I've lived all my life in the country, more shame for me not to know. Black. They are jet black, madam." And he went off again, swinging along to the music of some rhyme he had got hold of. When we came back, nothing would serve him, but he must read us the poems he had been speaking of, and Miss Pole encouraged him in his proposal, I thought, because she wished me to hear his beautiful reading, of which she had boasted, but she afterwards said it was because she had got to a difficult part of her crochet and wanted to count her stitches without having to talk. Whatever he had proposed would have been right to Miss Matty, although she did fall sound asleep within 5 minutes after he had begun a long poem called Locksley Hall and had a comfortable nap unobserved till he ended, when the cessation of his voice wakened her up and she said, feeling that something was expected and that Miss Pole was counting. "What a pretty book." "Pretty, madam? It's beautiful." "Pretty, indeed." "Oh yes. I meant beautiful," said she, fluttered at his disapproval of her word. "It is so like that beautiful poem of Dr. Johnson's my sister used to read. I forget the name of it. What was it, my dear?" Turning to me. "Which do you mean, ma'am? What was it about?" "I don't remember what it was about, and I've quite forgotten what the name of it was, but it was written by Dr. Johnson and was very beautiful and very like what Mr. Holbrook has just been reading." "I don't remember it," said he reflectively. "But I don't know Drive Johnson's poems well. I must read them." As we were getting into the flight to return, I heard Mr. Holbrook say he should call on the ladies soon and inquire how they got home, and this evidently pleased and fluttered Miss Matty at the time he said it, but after we had lost sight of the old house among the trees her sentiments towards the master of it were gradually absorbed into a distressing wonder as to whether Martha had broken her word and seized on the opportunity of her mistress's absence to have a follower. Martha looked good and steady and compassed enough as she came to help us out. She was always careful of Miss Matty, and tonight she made use of this unlucky speech. Dear ma'am, to think of your going out in an evening in such a thin shawl. It's no better than muslin. At your age, ma'am, you should be careful." "My age?" said Miss Matty, almost speaking crossly for her, for she was usually gentle. "My age? Why, how old do you think I am, that you talk about my age?" "Well, ma'am, I should say you were not far short of 60. But folks' looks is often against 'em, and I'm sure I meant no harm." "Martha, I'm not yet 52," said Miss Matty with grave emphasis. For probably the remembrance of her youth had come very vividly before her this day, and she was annoyed at finding that golden time so far away in the past. But she never spoke of any former and more intimate acquaintance with Mr. Holbrook. She had probably met with so little sympathy in her early love that she had shut it up close in her heart, and it was only by a sort of watching, which I could hardly avoid since Miss Pole's confidence, that I saw how faithful her poor heart had been in its sorrow and its silence. She gave me some good reason for wearing her best cap every day and sat near the window, in spite of her rheumatism, in order to see, without being seen, down into the street. He came. He put his open palms upon his knees, which were far apart, as he sat with his head bent down, whistling, after we had replied to his inquiries about our safe return. Suddenly he jumped up. "Well, madam, have you any commands for Paris? I am going there in a week or two." "To Paris?" we both exclaimed. "Yes, madam. I've never been there and always had a wish to go, and I think if I don't go soon, I mayn't go at all, so as soon as the hay is gotten I shall go before harvest time." We were so much astonished that we had no commissions. Just as he was going out of the room, he turned back with his favorite exclamation. "God bless my soul, madam, but I nearly forgot half my errand. Here are the poems for you admired so much the other evening at my house." He tugged away at a parcel in his coat pocket. "Goodbye, miss," said he. "Goodbye, Matty, take care of yourself." And he was gone. But he had given her a book, and he had called her Matty, just as he used to do 30 years ago. "I wish he would not go to Paris," said Miss Matilda anxiously. "I don't believe frogs will agree with him. He used to have to be very careful what he ate, which was curious in so strong-looking a young man." Soon after this I took my leave, giving many an injunction to Martha to look after her mistress and to let me know if she thought that Miss Matilda was not so well, in which case I would volunteer a visit to my old friend without noticing Martha's intelligence to her. Accordingly, I received a line or two from Martha every now and then. And, about November, I had a note to say her mistress was very low and sadly off her food, and the account made me so uneasy that, although Martha did not decidedly summon me, I packed up my things and went. I received a warm welcome, in spite of the little flurry produced by my impromptu visit, for I had only been able to give a day's notice. Miss Matilda looked miserably ill, and I prepared to comfort and cosset her. I went down to have a private talk with Martha. "How long has your mistress been so poorly?" I asked as I stood by the kitchen fire. "Well, I think it's better than a fortnight. It is, I know, it was one Tuesday, after Miss Pole had been, that she went into this moping way. I thought she was tired and it would go off with a night's rest, but no. She has gone on and on ever since, till I thought it my duty to write to you, ma'am." "You did quite right, Martha. It is a comfort to think she has so faithful a servant about her. And I hope you find your place comfortable?" "Well, ma'am, Mrs. is very kind, and there's plenty to eat and drink. And no more work, but what I can do easily." But Martha hesitated. "But what, Martha?" "Why, it seems so hard of Mrs. not to let me have any followers. There's such lots of young fellows in the town, and many a one has as much as offered to keep company with me, and I may never be in such a likely place again, and it's like wasting an opportunity. Many a girl, as I know, would have 'em unbeknownst to Mrs., but I've given my word. And I'll stick to it, or else this is just a house for Mrs. never to be the wiser if they did come. And it's such a capable kitchen, there's such dark corners in it, I'd be bound to hide any one. I counted up last Sunday night, for I'll not deny I was crying because I had to shut the door in Jem Hearn's face, and he's a steady young man, fit for any girl. Only I had given Mrs. my word." Martha was all but crying again, and I had little comfort to give her, for I knew, from old experience, of the horror with which both the Miss Jenkynses looked upon followers. And in Miss Matty's present nervous state, this dread was not likely to be lessened. I went to see Miss Pole the next day and took her completely by surprise, for she had not been to see Miss Matilda for 2 days. "And now I must go back with you, my dear, for I promised to let her know how Thomas Holbrook went on, and, I'm sorry to say, his housekeeper has sent me word today that he hasn't long to live. Poor Thomas. That journey to Paris was quite too much for him. His housekeeper says he has hardly ever been round his fields since, but just sits with his hands on his knees in the counting house, not reading or anything, but only saying what a wonderful city Paris was. Paris has much to answer for if it's killed my cousin Thomas, for a better man never lived." "Does Miss Matilda know of his illness?" asked I, a new light as to the cause of her indisposition dawning upon me. "Dear. To be sure, yes. Has not she told you?" "I let her know a fortnight ago, or more, when first I heard of it." "How odd she shouldn't have told you." "Not at all, I thought, but I did not say anything. I felt almost guilty of having spied too curiously into that tender heart, and I was not going to speak of its secrets hidden, Miss Matty believed, from all the world." I ushered Miss Pole into Miss Matilda's little drawing room and then left them alone. But I was not surprised when Martha came to my bedroom door to ask me to go down to dinner alone, for that Mrs. had one of her bad headaches. She came into the drawing room at tea time. But it was evidently an effort to her, and, as if to make up for some reproachful feeling against her late sister, Miss Jenkyns, which had been troubling her all the afternoon and for which she now felt penitent, she kept telling me how good and how clever Deborah was in her youth, how she used to settle what gowns they were to wear at all the parties, faint, ghostly ideas of grim parties, far away in the distance, when Miss Matty and Miss Pole were young. And how Deborah and her mother had started the Benefit Society for the Poor and taught girls cooking and plain sewing, and how Deborah had once danced with a lord. And how she used to visit at Sir Peter Arley's and tried to remodel the quiet rectory establishment on the plans of Arley Hall, where they kept 30 servants, and how she had nursed Miss Matty through a long illness, of which I had never heard before, but which I now dated in my own mind as following the dismissal of the suit of Mr. Holbrook. So we talked softly and quietly of old times through the long November evening. The next day Miss Pole brought us word that Mr. Holbrook was dead. Miss Matty heard the news in silence. In fact, from the account of the previous day, it was only what we had to expect. Miss Pole kept calling upon us for some expression of regret by asking if it was not sad that he was gone, and saying, "To think of that pleasant day last June, when he seemed so well. And he might have lived this dozen years if he had not gone to that wicked Paris, where they are always having revolutions." She paused for some demonstration on our part. I saw Miss Matty could not speak, she was trembling so nervously, so I said what I really felt. And after a call of some duration, all the time of which I have no doubt, Miss Pole thought Miss Matty received the news very calmly. Our visitor took her leave. Miss Matty made a strong effort to conceal her feelings, a concealment she practiced even with me, for she has never alluded to Mr. Holbrook again, although the bookie gave her lies with her Bible on the little table by her bedside. She did not think I heard her when she asked the little milliner of Cranford to make her cap something like the Honorable Mrs. Jameson's, or that I noticed a reply. But she wears widow's caps, ma'am? Oh. I only meant something in that style, not widows, of course, but rather like Mrs. Jameson's. This effort at concealment was the beginning of the tremulous motion of head and hands which I have seen ever since in Miss Matty. The evening of the day on which we heard of Mr. Holbrook's death, Miss Matilda was very silent and thoughtful. After prayers she called Martha back, and then she stood uncertain what to say. "Martha," she said at last, "you are young," and then she made so long a pause that Martha, to remind her of her half-finished sentence, dropped a curtsy and said, "Yes please ma'am, 22 last 3rd of October please, ma'am. And, perhaps, Martha, you may some time meet with a young man you like. And who likes you. I did say you were not to have followers, but if you meet with such a young man and tell me, and I find he is respectable, I have no objection to his coming to see you once a week. God forbid," said she in a low voice, "that I should grieve any young hearts." She spoke as if she were providing for some distant contingency and was rather startled when Martha made a ready, eager answer. "Please, ma'am, there's Jem Hearn, and he's a joiner making 3 and 6pence a day and 6'1" in his stocking feet, please, ma'am, and if you'll ask about him tomorrow morning, everyone will give him a character for steadiness and he'll be glad enough to come. Tomorrow night, I'll be bound." Though Miss Matty was startled, she submitted to fate and love. Chapter 5. Old Letters. I have often noticed that almost everyone has his own individual small economies, careful habits of saving fractions of pennies in some one peculiar direction, any disturbance of which annoys him more than spending shillings or pounds on some real extravagance. An old gentleman of my acquaintance who took the intelligence of the failure of a joint stock bank in which some of his money was invested with stoical mildness worried his family all through a long summer's day because one of them had torn, instead of cutting, out the written leaves of his now useless bank book. Of course, the corresponding pages at the other end came out as well, and this little unnecessary waste of paper, his private economy, chafed him more than all the loss of his money. Envelopes fretted his soul terribly when they first came in. The only way in which he could reconcile himself to such waste of his cherished article was by patiently turning inside out all that were sent to him and so making them serve again. Even now, though tamed by age, I see him casting wistful glances at his daughters when they send a hole inside of a half sheet of notepaper with the 3 lines of acceptance to an invitation written on only one of the sides. I am not above owning that I have this human weakness myself. String is my foible. My pockets get full of little hanks of it, picked up and twisted together, ready for uses that never come. I am seriously annoyed if anyone cuts the string of a parcel instead of patiently and faithfully undoing it, fold by fold. How people can bring themselves to use India rubber rings, which are a sort of defecation of string, as lightly as they do, I cannot imagine. To me, an India rubber ring is a precious treasure. I have one which is not new, one that I picked up off the floor nearly 6 years ago. I have really tried to use it, but my heart failed me, and I could not commit the extravagance. Small pieces of butter grieve others. They cannot attend to conversation because of the annoyance occasioned by the habit which some people have of invariably taking more butter than they want. Have you not seen the anxious look, almost mesmeric, which such persons fix on the article? They would feel it a relief if they might bury it out of their sight by popping it into their own mouths and swallowing it down. And they are really made happy if the person on whose plate it lies unused suddenly breaks off a piece of toast, which he does not want at all, and eats up his butter. They think that this is not waste. Now Miss Matty Jenkyns was chary of candles. We had many devices to use as few as possible. In the winter afternoons she would sit knitting for 2 or 3 hours. She could do this in the dark or by firelight, and when I asked if I might not ring for candles to finish stitching my wristbands, she told me to keep blind man's holiday. They were usually brought in with tea, but we only burned one at a time, as we lived in constant preparation for a friend who might come in any evening. But who never did. It required some contrivance to keep our 2 candles of the same length, ready to be lighted, and to look as if we burnt 2 always. The candles took it in turns, and, whatever we might be talking about or doing, Miss Matty's eyes were habitually fixed upon the candle, ready to jump up and extinguish it and to light the other before they had become too uneven in length to be restored to equality. In the course of the evening, one night, I remember this candle economy particularly annoyed me. I had been very much tired of my compulsory blind man's holiday, especially as Miss Matty had fallen asleep and I did not like to stir the fire and run the risk of awakening her, so I could not even sit on the rug and scorch myself with sewing by firelight, according to my usual custom. I fancied Miss Matty must be dreaming of her early life, for she spoke 1 or 2 words in her uneasy sleep bearing reference to persons who were dead long before. When Martha brought in the lighted candle and tea, Miss Matty started into wakefulness with a strange, bewildered look around, as if we were not the people she expected to see about her. There was a little sad expression that shadowed her face as she recognized me, but immediately afterwards she tried to give me her usual smile. All through tea time her talk ran upon the days of her childhood and youth. Perhaps this reminded her of the desirableness of looking over all the old family letters and destroying such as ought not to be allowed to fall into the hands of strangers, for she had often spoken of the necessity of this task, but had always shrunk from it with a timid dread of something painful. Tonight, however, she rose up after tea and went for them in the dark, for she piqued herself on the precise neatness of all her chamber arrangements and used to look uneasily at me when I lighted a bed candle to go to another room for anything. When she returned there was a faint pleasant smell of Tonquin beans in the room. I had always noticed this scent about any of the things which had belonged to her mother, and many of the letters were addressed to her yellow bundles of love letters, 60 or 70 years old. Miss Matty undid the packet with a sigh, but she stifled it directly, as if it were hardly right to regret the flight of time, or of life either. We agreed to look them over separately, each taking a different letter out of the same bundle and describing its contents to the other before destroying it. I never knew what sad work the reading of old letters was before that evening, though I could hardly tell why. The letters were as happy as letters could be, at least those early letters were. There was in them a vivid and intense sense of the present time, which seemed so strong and full, as if it could never pass away, and as if the warm, living hearts that so expressed themselves could never die and be as nothing to the sunny earth. I should have felt less melancholy, I believe, if the letters had been more so. I saw the tears stealing down the well-worn furrows of Miss Matty's cheeks, and her spectacles often wanted wiping. I trusted at last that she would light the other candle, for my own eyes were rather dim, and I wanted more light to see the pale, faded ink, but no, even through her tears, she saw and remembered her little economical ways. The earliest set of letters were 2 bundles tied together and ticketed in Miss Jenkyns' handwriting, letters interchanged between my ever-honored father and my dearly beloved mother prior to their marriage in July 1774. I should guess that the rector of Cranford was about 27 years of age when he wrote those letters, and Miss Matty told me that her mother was just 18 at the time of her wedding. With my idea of the rector derived from a picture in the dining parlor, stiff and stately, in a huge full-bottomed wig, with gown, cassock, and bands, and his hand upon a copy of the only sermon he ever published. It was strange to read these letters. They were full of eager, passionate ardor, short homely sentences, right fresh from the heart, very different from the grand Latinized Johnsonian style of the printed sermon preached before some judge at assize time. His letters were a curious contrast to those of his girl bride. She was evidently rather annoyed at his demands upon her for expressions of love and could not quite understand what he meant by repeating the same thing over in so many different ways, but what she was quite clear about was a longing for a white paduasoy whatever that might be, and 6 or 7 letters were principally occupied in asking her lover to use his influence with her parents, who evidently kept her in good order, to obtain this or that article of dress, more especially the white paduasoy. He cared nothing how she was dressed, she was always lovely enough for him, as he took pains to assure her when she begged him to express in his answers a predilection for particular pieces of finery in order that she might show what he said to her parents. But at length, he seemed to find out that she would not be married till she had a trousseau to her mind, and then he sent her a letter which had evidently accompanied a whole box full of finery and in which he requested that she might be dressed in everything her heart desired. This was the first letter, ticketed in a frail, delicate hand, from my dearest John. Shortly afterwards they were married, I suppose, from the intermission in their correspondence. "We must burn them, I think," said Miss Matty, looking doubtfully at me. "No one will care for them when I am gone." And one by one she dropped them into the middle of the fire, watching each blaze up, die out, and rise away, in faint white ghostly semblance, up the chimney, before she gave another to the same fate. The room was light enough now, but I, like her, was fascinated into watching the destruction of those letters into which the honest warmth of a manly heart had been poured forth. The next letter, likewise docketed by Miss Jenkyns, was endorsed. "Letter of pious congratulation and exhortation from my venerable grandfather to my beloved mother on occasion of my own birth." Also, some practical remarks on the desirability of keeping warm the extremities of infants from my excellent grandmother. The first part was, indeed, a severe and forcible picture of the responsibilities of mothers and a warning against the evils that were in the world and lying in ghastly wait for the little baby of 2 days old. His wife did not write, said the old gentleman, because he had forbidden it, she being indisposed with a sprained ankle, which, he said, quite incapacitated her from holding a pen. However, at the foot of the page was a small TO, and on turning it over, sure enough, there was a letter to my dearest Molly, begging her, when she left her room, whatever she did, to go upstairs before going down, and telling her to wrap her baby's feet up in flannel and keep it warm by the fire, although it was summer, for babies were so tender. It was pretty to see from the letters, which were evidently exchanged with some frequency between the young mother and the grandmother, how the girlish vanity was being weeded out of her heart by love for her baby. The white paduasoy figured again in the letters with almost as much vigor as before. In one, it was being made into a christening cloak for the baby. It decked it when it went with its parents to spend a day or two at Arley Hall. It added to its charms when it was the prettiest little baby that ever was seen. Dear mother, I wish you could see her. Without any partiality, I do think she will grow up a regular beauty. I thought of Miss Jenkyns, grey, withered, and wrinkled, and I wondered if her mother had known her in the courts of heaven. And then I knew that she had, and that they stood there in angelic guise. There was a great gap before any of the rector's letters appeared. And then his wife had changed her mode of her endorsement. It was no longer from my dearest John, it was from my honored husband. The letters were written on occasion of the publication of the same sermon which was represented in the picture. The preaching before my Lord Judge and the publishing by request was evidently the culminating point, the event of his life. It had been necessary for him to go up to London to superintend it through the press. Many friends had to be called upon and consulted before he could decide on any printer fit for so onerous a task, and at length it was arranged that J&J Rivingtons were to have the honorable responsibility. The worthy rector seemed to be strung up by the occasion to a high literary pitch, for he could hardly write a letter to his wife without cropping out into Latin. I remember the end of one of his letters ran thus: "I shall ever hold the virtuous qualities of my Molly in remembrance, dum memor ips mei, dum spiritus regit artis," which, considering that the English of his correspondent was sometimes at fault in grammar and often in spelling, might be taken as a proof of how much he idealized his Molly, and, as Miss Jenkyns used to say, people talk a great deal about idealizing nowadays, whatever that may mean. But this was nothing to a fit of writing classical poetry which soon seized him, in which his Molly figured away as Maria. The letter containing the Carmen was Endorsed by her, Hebrew verses sent me by my honored husband. I thought to have had a letter about killing the pig, but must wait. Mem. 2. Send the poetry to Sir Peter Arley, as my husband desires. And in a postscriptum note in his handwriting it was stated that the ode had appeared in the Gentleman's Magazine December 1782. Her letters back to her husband, treasured as fondly by him as if they had been nt Ciceronis epistolae, were more satisfactory to an absent husband and father than his could ever have been to her. She told him how Deborah sewed her seam very neatly every day and read to her in the books he had set her, how she was a very Ferrard good child, but would ask questions her mother could not answer, but how she did not let herself down by saying she did not know but took to stirring the fire or sending the Ferrard child on an errand. Matty was now the mother's darling and promised, like her sister at her age, to be a great beauty. I was reading this aloud to Miss Matty, who smiled and sighed a little at the hope, so fondly expressed, that little Matty might not be vain, even if she were a beauty. I had very pretty hair, my dear, said Miss Matilda, and not a bad mouth. And I saw her soon afterwards adjust her cap and draw herself up. But to return to Mrs. Jenkyns' letters. She told her husband about the poor in the parish, what homely domestic medicines she had administered, what kitchen physic she had sent. She had evidently held his displeasure as a rod in pickle over the heads of all the ne'er-do-wells. She asked for his directions about the cows and pigs and did not always obtain them, as I have shown before. The kind old grandmother was dead when a little boy was born, soon after the publication of the sermon, but there was another letter of exhortation from the grandfather, more stringent and admonitory than ever, now that there was a boy to be guarded from the snares of the world. He described all the various sins into which men might fall. Until I wondered how any man ever came to a natural death. The gallows seemed as if it must have been the termination of the lives of most of the grandfather's friends and acquaintance, and I was not surprised at the way in which he spoke of this life being a vale of tears. It seemed curious that I should never have heard of this brother before. But I concluded that he had died young, or else surely his name would have been alluded to by his sisters. By and by we came to packets of Miss Jenkyns' letters. These Miss Matty did regret to burn. She said all the others had been only interesting to those who loved the writers and that it seemed as if it would have hurt her to allow them to fall into the hands of strangers who had not known her dear mother and how good she was, although she did not always spell quite in the modern fashion, but Deborah's letters were so very superior. Anyone might profit by reading them. It was a long time since she had read Mrs. Chapin, but she knew she used to think that Deborah could have said the same things quite as well, and as for Mrs. Carter, people thought a deal of her letters just because she had written Epictetus, but she was quite sure Deborah would never have made use of such a common expression as "I canna be fashed." Picture. I made use of the time to think of many other things. Miss Matty did grudge burning these letters, it was evident. She would not let them be carelessly passed over with any quiet reading and skipping to myself. She took them from me and even lighted the second candle in order to read them aloud with a proper emphasis and without stumbling over the big words. Oh dear. How I wanted facts instead of reflections before those letters were concluded. They lasted us 2 nights, and I won't deny that I made use of the time to think of many other things, and yet I was always at my post at the end of each sentence. The rector's letters and those of his wife and mother-in-law had all been tolerably short and pithy, written in a straight hand, with the lines very close together. Sometimes the whole letter was contained on a mere scrap of paper. The paper was very yellow and the ink very brown. Some of the sheets were, as Miss Matty made me observe, the old original post, with the stamp in the corner representing a postboy writing for life and twanging his horn. The letters of Mrs. Jenkyns and her mother were fastened with a great round red wafer, for it was before Miss Edgeworth's patronage had banished wafers from polite society. It was evident, from the tenor of what was said, that francs were in great request and were even used as a means of paying debts by needy members of Parliament. The rector sealed his epistles with an immense coat of arms and showed by the care with which he had performed this ceremony that he expected they should be cut open, not broken by any thoughtless or impatient hand. Now, Miss Jenkyns' letters were of a later date in form and writing. She wrote on the square sheet which we have learned to call old-fashioned. Her hand was admirably calculated. Together with her use of many-syllabled words to fill up a sheet, and then came the pride and delight of crossing. Poor Miss Matty got sadly puzzled with this, for the words gathered size like snowballs, and towards the end of her letter Miss Jenkyns used to become quite sesquipedalian. In one to her father, slightly theological and controversial in its tone, she had spoken of Herod, Tetrarch of Idumea. Miss Matty read it Herod Petrarch of Etruria and was just as well pleased as if she had been right. I can't quite remember the date, but I think it was in 1805 that Miss Jenkyns wrote the longest series of letters on occasion of her absence. On a visit to some friends near Newcastle upon Tyne. These friends were intimate with the commandant of the garrison there and heard from him of all the preparations that were being made to repel the invasion of Buonaparte, which some people imagined might take place at the mouth of the Tyne. Miss Jenkyns was evidently very much alarmed, and the first part of her letters was often written in pretty intelligible English, conveying particulars of the preparations which were made in the family with whom she was residing against a dreaded event, the bundles of clothes that were packed up ready for a flight to Alston Moor, a wild, hilly piece of ground between Northumberland and Cumberland, the signal that was to be given for this flight and for the simultaneous turning out of the volunteers under arms, which said signal was to consist, if I remember rightly, in ringing the church bells in a particular and ominous manner. One day, when Miss Jenkyns and her hosts were at a dinner party in Newcastle, this warning summons was actually given, not a very wise proceeding, if there be any truth in the moral attached to the fable of the boy and the wolf, but so it was, and Miss Jenkyns, hardly recovered from her fright, wrote the next day to describe the sound, the breathless shock, the hurry and alarm, and then, taking breath, she added, "How trivial, my dear father, do all our apprehensions of the last evening appear, at the present moment, to calm and inquiring minds." And here Miss Matty broke in with, "But, indeed, my dear, they were not at all trivial or trifling at the time. I know I used to wake up in the night many a time and think I heard the tramp of the French entering Cranford. Many people talked of hiding themselves in the salt mines, and meat would have kept capitally down there, only perhaps we should have been thirsty. And my father preached a whole set of sermons on the occasion, one set in the mornings, all about David and Goliath, to spirit up the people to fighting with spades or bricks, if need were, and the other set in the afternoons, proving that Napoleon, that was another name for Boney, as we used to call him, was all the same as an Apollyon and a Abaddon. I remember my father rather thought he should be asked to print this last set, but the parish had, perhaps, had enough of them with hearing. Peter Marmaduke Arley Jenkyns, poor Peter, as Miss Matty began to call him, was at school at Shrewsbury by this time. The rector took up his pen and rubbed up his Latin once more to correspond with his boy. It was very clear that the lads were what are called show letters. They were of a highly mental description, giving an account of his studies and his intellectual hopes of various kinds, with an occasional quotation from the classics, but, now and then, the animal nature broke out in such a little sentence as this, evidently written in a trembling hurry, after the letter had been inspected. "Mother dear, do send me a cake and put plenty of citron in." The mother dear probably answered her boy in the form of cakes and goody, for there were none of her letters among this set, but a whole collection of the rector's, to whom the Latin in his boy's letters was like a trumpet to the old war horse. I do not know much about Latin, certainly, and it is, perhaps, an ornamental language, but not very useful, I think, at least to judge from the bits I remember out of the rector's letters. One was, "You have not got that town in your map of Ireland, but bonus Bernardus non vidit omnia, as the proverbia say." Presently it became very evident that poor Peter got himself into many scrapes. There were letters of stilted penitence to his father for some wrongdoing, and among them all was a badly written, badly sealed, badly directed, blotted note. "My dearest mother, I will be a better boy, I will. Indeed, but don't, please, be ill for me, I am not worth it, but I will be good, darling mother." Miss Matty could not speak for crying after she had read this note. She gave it to me in silence and then got up and took it to her sacred recesses in her own room for fear, by any chance, it might get burned. "Poor Peter," she said, "he was always in scrapes, he was too easy. They led him wrong and then left him in the lurch. But he was too fond of mischief. He could never resist a joke. Poor Peter." Chapter 6. Poor Peter. Poor Peter's career lay before him rather pleasantly mapped out by kind friends, but bonus Bernardus non videt omnia in this map too. He was to win honours at the Shrewsbury School and carry them thick to Cambridge, and after that, a living awaited him, the gift of his godfather Sir Peter Arley. Poor Peter. His lot in life was very different to what his friends had hoped and planned. Miss Matty told me all about it, and I think it was a relief when she had done so. He was the darling of his mother, who seemed to dote on all her children, though she was, perhaps, a little afraid of Deborah's superior acquirements. Deborah was the favorite of her father, and when Peter disappointed him, she became his pride. The sole honor Peter brought away from Shrewsbury was the reputation of being the best good fellow that ever was, and of being the captain of the school in the art of practical joking. His father was disappointed, but set about remedying the matter in a manly way. He could not afford to send Peter to read with any tutor, but he could read with him himself, and Miss Matty told me much of the awful preparations in the way of dictionaries and lexicons that were made in her father's study the morning Peter began. "My poor mother," said she. "I remember how she used to stand in the hall, just near enough the study door, to catch the tone of my father's voice. I could tell in a moment if all was going right by her face. And it did go right for a long time." "What went wrong at last?" said I. "That tiresome Latin, I dare say." "No. It was not the Latin." Peter was in high favor with my father, for he worked up well for him. But he seemed to think that the Cranford people might be joked about and made fun of, and they did not like it. Nobody does. He was always hoaxing them. Hoaxing is not a pretty word, my dear, and I hope you won't tell your father I used it, for I should not like him to think that I was not choice in my language after living with such a woman as Deborah. And be sure you never use it yourself. I don't know how it slipped out of my mouth, except it was that I was thinking of poor Peter, and it was always his expression. But he was a very gentlemanly boy in many things. He was like dear Captain Brown in always being ready to help any old person or a child. Still, he did like joking and making fun, and he seemed to think the old ladies in Cranford would believe anything. There were many old ladies living here then. We are principally ladies now, I know, but we are not so old as the ladies used to be when I was a girl. I could laugh to think of some of Peter's jokes. No, my dear, I won't tell you of them, because they might not shock you as they ought to do, and they were very shocking. He even took in my father once by dressing himself up as a lady that was passing through the town and wished to see the rector of Cranford, who had published that admirable assize sermon. Peter said he was awfully frightened himself when he saw how my father took it all in, and even offered to copy out all his Napoleon Bonaparte sermons for her, for Peter was a lady then. He told me he was more terrified than he ever was before, all the time my father was speaking. He did not think my father would have believed him, and yet if he had not, it would have been a sad thing for Peter. As it was, he was none so glad of it, for my father kept him hard at work copying out all those 12 Bonaparte sermons for the lady that was for Peter himself. You know, he was the lady. And once when he wanted to go fishing, Peter said, "Confound the woman." Very bad language, my dear, but Peter was not always so guarded as he should have been. My father was so angry with him, it nearly frightened me out of my wits. And yet I could hardly keep from laughing at the little curtsies Peter kept making, quite slyly, whenever my father spoke of the lady's excellent taste and sound discrimination. Picture. Confound the woman. Did Miss Jenkyns know of these tricks? Said I. Oh, no. Deborah would have been too much shocked. No, no one knew but me. I wish I had always known of Peter's plans, but sometimes he did not tell me. He used to say the old ladies in the town wanted something to talk about, but I don't think they did. They had the St. James Chronicle 3 times a week, just as we have now, and we have plenty. to say, and I remember the clacking noise there always was when some of the ladies got together. But, probably, schoolboys talk more than ladies. At last there was a terrible, sad thing happened. Miss Matty got up, went to the door, and opened it. No one was there. She rang the bell for Martha, and when Martha came, her mistress told her to go for eggs to a farm at the other end of the town. "I will lock the door after you, Martha. You are not afraid to go, are you?" "No, ma'am, not at all. Jem Hearn will be only too proud to go with me." Miss Matty drew herself up, and as soon as we were alone, she wished that Martha had more maidenly reserve. "We'll put out the candle, my dear. We can talk just as well by firelight, you know." There. Well, you see, Deborah had gone from home. For a fortnight or so, it was a very still, quiet day, I remember. Overhead, and the lilacs were all in flower, so I suppose it was spring. My father had gone out to see some sick people in the parish. I recollect seeing him leave the house with his wig and shovel hat and cane. What possessed our poor Peter the First don't know, he had the sweetest temper, and yet he always seemed to like to plague Deborah. She never laughed at his jokes and thought him ungenteel and not careful enough about improving his mind, and that vexed him. Well, he went to her room, it seems, and dressed himself in her old gown and shawl and bonnet, just the things she used to wear in Cranford, and was known by everywhere, and he made the pillow into a little. "You are sure you locked the door, my dear, for I should not like anyone to hear into a little baby with white long clothes. It was only, as he told me afterwards, to make something to talk about in the town. He never thought of it as affecting Deborah." And he went and walked up and down in the filbert walk, just half hidden by the rails and half seen, and he cuddled his pillow just like a baby and talked to it all the nonsense people do. Oh dear. And my father came stepping stately up the street, as he always did, and what should he see but a little black crowd of people, I dare say as many as 20, all peeping through his garden rails. So he thought, at first, they were only looking at a new rhododendron that was in full bloom and that he was very proud of, and he walked slower that they might have more time to admire. And he wondered if he could make out a sermon from the occasion, and thought, perhaps, there was some relation between the rhododendrons and the lilies of the field. My poor father. When he came nearer, he began to wonder that they did not see him, but their heads were all so close together, peeping and peeping. My father was amongst them, meaning, he said, to ask them to walk into the garden with him and admire the beautiful vegetable production, when oh, my dear, I trembled to think of it. He looked through the rails himself and saw. I don't know what he thought he saw, but old Claire told me his face went quite grey-white with anger, and his eyes blazed out under his frowning black brows, and he spoke out oh, so terribly, and bade them all stop where they were, not one of them to go, not one of them to stir a step. And, swift as light, he was in at the garden door and down the filbert walk and seized hold of poor Peter and tore his clothes off his back, bonnet, shawl, gown, and all, and threw the pillow among the people over the railings. And then he was very, very angry indeed, and before all the people he lifted up his cane and flogged Peter. My dear, that boy's trick, on that sunny day when all seemed going straight and well, broke my mother's heart and changed my father for life. It did, indeed. Old Claire said. Peter looked as white as my father and stood as still as a statue to be flogged, and my father struck hard. When my father stopped to take breath, Peter said, "Have you done enough, sir?" Quite hoarsely, and still standing quite quiet. I don't know what my father said or if he said anything. But old Claire said. Peter turned to where the people outside the railing were and made them a low bow, as grand and as grave as any gentleman, and then walked slowly into the house. I was in the storeroom helping my mother to make cowslip wine. I cannot abide the wine now, nor the scent of the flowers. They turned me sick and faint, as they did that day when Peter came in, looking as haughty as any man, indeed, looking like a man, not like a boy. "Mother," he said, "I am come to say, God bless you for ever." I saw his lips quiver as he spoke, and I think he durst not say anything more loving for the purpose that was in his heart. She looked at him rather frightened and wondering and asked him what was to do. He did not smile or speak, but put his arms round her and kissed her as if he did not know how to leave off, and before she could speak again, he was gone. We talked it over and could not understand it, and she bade me go and seek my father and ask what it was all about. I found him walking up and down, looking very highly displeased. Tell your mother I have flogged Peter and that he richly deserved it. I durst not ask any more questions. When I told my mother, she sat down, quite faint, for a minute. I remember, a few days after, I saw the poor, withered cowslip flowers thrown out to the leaf heap, to decay. And there was no making of cowslip wine that year at the rectory nor, indeed, ever after. Presently my mother went to my father. I know I thought of Queen Esther and King Ahasuerus, for my mother was very pretty and delicate looking, and my father looked as terrible as King Ahasuerus. Some time after they came out together, and then my mother told me what had happened and that she was going up to Peter's room at my father's. Desired though she was not to tell Peter this to talk the matter over with him. But no Peter was there. We looked over the house, no Peter was there. Even my father, who had not liked to join in the search at first, helped us before long. The rectory was a very old house, steps up into a room, steps down into a room, all through. At first, my mother went calling low and soft, as if to reassure the poor boy Peter. Peter, dear. It's only me, but, by and by, as the servants came back from the errands my father had sent them, in different directions, to find where Peter was, as we found he was not in the garden, nor the hayloft, nor anywhere about, my mother's cry grew louder and wilder. Peter. Peter, my darling. Where are you? For then she felt and understood that that long kiss meant some sad kind of goodbye. The afternoon went on, my mother never resting, but seeking again and again in every possible place that had been looked into 20 times before. Nay, that she had looked into over and over again herself. My father sat with his head in his hands, not speaking except when his messengers came in, bringing no tidings. Then he lifted up his face, so strong and sad, and told them to go again in some new direction. My mother kept passing from room to room, in and out of the house, moving noiselessly, but never ceasing. Neither she nor my father durst leave the house, which was the meeting place for all the messengers. At last, and it was nearly dark, my father rose up. He took hold of my mother's arm as she came with wild, sad pace through one door and quickly towards another. She started at the touch of his hand, for she had forgotten all in the world but Peter. Molly, said he, I did not think all this would happen. He looked into her face for comfort, her poor face all wild and white, for neither she nor my father had dared to acknowledge, much less act upon, the terror that was in their hearts, lest Peter should have made away with himself. My father saw no conscious look in his wife's hot, dreary eyes, and he missed a sympathy that she had always been ready to give him, strong man as he was, and at the dumb despair in her face his tears began to flow. But when she saw this, a gentle sorrow came over her countenance. And she said, Dearest John, don't cry, come with me, and we'll find him, almost as cheerfully as if she knew where he was. And she took my father's great hand in her little soft one and led him along, the tears dropping as he walked on that same unceasing, weary walk from room to room, through house and garden. Oh, how I wished for Deborah. I had no time for crying, for now all seemed to depend on me. I wrote for Deborah to come home. I sent a message privately to that same Mr. Holbrook's house. Poor Mr. Holbrook, you know who I mean. I don't mean I sent a message to him, but I sent one that I could trust to know if Peter was at his house. For at one time, Mr. Holbrook was an occasional visitor at the rectory, you know he was Miss Pole's cousin, and he had been very kind to Peter and taught him how to fish. He was very kind to everybody, and I thought Peter might have gone off there. But Mr. Holbrook was from home, and Peter had never been seen. It was night now, but the doors were all wide open, and my father and mother walked on and on. It was more than an hour since he had joined her, and I don't believe they had ever spoken all that time. I was getting the parlor fire lighted, and one of the servants was preparing tea, for I wanted them to have something to eat and drink and warm them, when old Claire asked to speak to me. I have borrowed the nets from the weir Miss Matty. Shall we drag the ponds tonight or wait for the morning? I remember staring in his face to gather his meaning, and when I did, I laughed out loud. The horror of that new thought, our bright, darling Peter, cold and stark and dead. I remember the ring of my own laugh. Now. The next day Deborah was at home before I was myself again. She would not have been so weak as to give way as I had done, but my screams, my horrible laughter had ended in crying, had roused my sweet dear mother, whose poor wandering wits were called back and collected as soon as a child needed her care. She and Deborah sat by my bedside. I knew by the looks of each that there had been no news of Peter, no awful, ghastly news, which was what I most had dreaded in my dull state between sleeping and waking. The same result of all the searching had brought something of the same relief to my mother, to whom, I am sure, the thought that Peter might even then be hanging dead in some of the familiar home places had caused that never-ending walk of yesterday. Her soft eyes never were the same again after that. They had always a restless, craving look, as if seeking for what they could not find. Oh. It was an awful time, coming down like a thunderbolt on the still sunny day when the lilacs were all in bloom. Where was Mr. Peter? Said I. He had made his way to Liverpool, and there was war then, and some of the king's ships lay off the mouth of the Mersey, and they were only too glad to have a fine likely boy such as him, 5'9" he was, come to offer himself. The captain wrote to my father, and Peter wrote to my mother. Stay. Those letters will be somewhere here. We lighted the candle and found the captain's letter and Peter's too. And we also found a little simple begging letter from Mrs. Jenkyns to Peter, addressed to him at the house of an old schoolfellow whither she fancied he might have gone. They had returned it unopened and unopened. It had remained ever since, having been inadvertently put by among the other letters of that time. This is it. My dearest Peter, you did not think we should be so sorry as we are, I know, or you would never have gone away. You are too good. Your father sits and sighs till my heart aches to hear him. He cannot hold up his head for grief, and yet he only did what he thought was right. Perhaps he has been too severe, and perhaps I have not been kind enough, but God knows how we love you, my dear only boy. Don looks so sorry you are gone. Come back and make us happy, who love you so much. I know you will come back. But Peter did not come back. That spring day was the last time he ever saw his mother's face. The writer of the letter, the last, the only person who had ever seen what was written in it, was dead long ago, and I, a stranger, not born at the time when this occurrence took place, was the one to open it. The captain's letter summoned the father and mother to Liverpool instantly if they wished to see their boy, and, by some of the wild chances of life, the captain's letter had been detained somewhere. Somehow. Miss Matty went on, and it was race time, and all the post horses at Cranford were gone to the races, but my father and mother set off in our own gig, and oh, my dear, they were too late, the ship was gone. And now. Read Peter's letter to my mother. It was full of love and sorrow and pride in his new profession and a sore sense of his disgrace in the eyes of the people at Cranford, but ending with a passionate entreaty that she would come and see him before he left the Mersey. Mother, we may go into battle. I hope we shall. And lick those French? But I must see you again before that time. And she was too late, said Miss Matty, too late. We sat in silence, pondering on the full meaning of those sad, sad words. At length I asked Miss Matty to tell me how her mother bore it. Oh. She said, she was patience itself. She had never been strong. And this weakened her terribly. My father used to sit looking at her. Far more sad than she was. He seemed as if he could look at nothing else when she was by, and he was so humble, so very gentle now. He would, perhaps, speak in his old way, laying down the law, as it were, and then, in a minute or two, he would come round and put his hand on our shoulders and ask us in a low voice if he had said anything to hurt us. I did not wonder at his speaking so to Deborah, for she was so clever, but I could not bear to hear him talking so to me. But, you see, he saw what we did not, that it was killing my mother. Yes. Killing her. Put out the candle, my dear, I can talk better in the dark, for she was but a frail woman and ill-fitted to stand the fright and shock she had gone through, and she would smile at him and comfort him, not in words, but in her looks and tones, which were always cheerful when he was there. and she would speak of how she thought Peter stood a good chance of being admiral very soon, he was so brave and clever, and how she thought of seeing him in his navy uniform and what sort of hats admirals wore and how much more fit he was to be a sailor than a clergyman, and all in that way just to make my father think she was quite glad of what came of that unlucky morning's work and the flogging which was always in his mind, as we all knew. But oh, my dear. The bitter, bitter crying she had when she was alone, and at last, as she grew weaker, she could not keep her tears in when Deborah or me was by and would give us message after message for Peter. His ship had gone to the Mediterranean or somewhere down there, and then he was ordered off to India, and there was no overland route then, but she still said that no one knew where their death lay in wait and that we were not to think hers was near. We did not think it, but we knew it as we saw her fading away. Well, my dear, it's very foolish of me, I know, when in all likelihood I am so near seeing her again. And only think, love. The very day after her death, for she did not live quite a 12-month after Peter went away, the very day after came a parcel for her from India from her poor boy. It was a large, soft, white Indian shawl with just a little narrow border all round, just what my mother would have liked. We thought it might rouse my father, for he had sat with her hand in his all night long, so Deborah took it into him and Peter's letter to her and all. At first, he took no notice, and we tried to make a kind of light careless talk about the shawl, opening it out and admiring it. Then, suddenly, he got up and spoke. She shall be buried in it, he said. Peter shall have that comfort, and she would have liked it. Well, perhaps it was not reasonable, but what could we do or say? One gives people in grief their own way. He took it up and felt it. It is just such a shawl as she wished for when she was married, and her mother did not give it her. I did not know of it till after, or she should have had it, she should, but she shall have it now. My mother looked so lovely in her death. She was always pretty, and now she looked fair and waxen and younger than Deborah as she stood trembling and shivering by her. We decked her in the long soft folds, she lay smiling as if pleased, and people came, all Cranford came to beg to see her, for they had loved her dearly, as well they might, and the countrywomen brought posies. Old Clare's wife brought some white violets and begged they might lie on her breast. Deborah said to me, the day of my mother's funeral, that if she had 100 offers she never would marry and leave my father. It was not very likely she would have so many. I don't know that she had one, but it was not less to her credit to say so. She was such a daughter to my father as I think there never was before or since. His eyes failed him. And she read book after book and wrote and copied and was always at his service in any parish business. She could do many more things than my poor mother could. She even once wrote a letter to the bishop for my father. But he missed my mother sorely, the whole parish noticed it. Not that he was less active, I think he was more so, and more patient in helping everyone. I did all I could to set Deborah at liberty to be with him, for I knew I was good for little and that my best work in the world was to do odd jobs quietly and set others at liberty. But my father was a changed man. Did Mr. Peter ever come home? Yes, once. He came home a lieutenant, he did not get to be admiral. And he and my father were such friends. My father took him into every house in the parish, he was so proud of him. He never walked out without Peter's arm to lean upon. Deborah used to smile. I don't think we ever laughed again after my mother's death and say she was quite put in a corner. Not but what my father always wanted her when there was letter writing or reading to be done or anything to be settled. And then? Said I, after a pause. Then Peter went to sea again, and by, my father died, blessing us both and thanking Deborah for all she had been to him, and, of course, our circumstances were changed, and, instead of living at the rectory and keeping 3 maids and a man, we had to come to this small house and be content with a servant of all work, but, as Deborah used to say, we have always lived genteelly, even if circumstances have compelled us to simplicity. Poor Deborah. And Mr. Peter? Asked I. Oh, there was some great war in India, I forget what they call it, and we have never heard of Peter since then. I believe he is dead myself, and it sometimes fidgets me that we have never put on mourning for him. And Then again, when I sit by myself and all the house is still, I think I hear his step coming up the street and my heart begins to flutter and beat, but the sound always goes past and Peter never comes. That's Martha back? No. I'll go, my dear, I can always find my way. In the dark, you know. And a blow of fresh air at the door will do my head good, and it's rather got a trick of aching. So she pattered off. I had lighted the candle to give the room a cheerful appearance against her return. Was it Martha? Asked I. Yes. And I am rather uncomfortable, for I heard such a strange noise just as I was opening the door. Where? I asked, for her eyes were round with affright. In the street just outside, it sounded like talking? I put in, as she hesitated a little. No. Kissing? Chapter 7. Visiting. One morning, as Miss Matty and I sat at our work, it was before 12 o'clock, and Miss Matty had not changed the cap with yellow ribbons that had been Miss Jenkyns' best and which Miss Matty was now wearing out in private, putting on the one made in imitation of Mrs. Jameson's at all times when she expected to be seen. Martha came up and asked if Miss Betty Barker might speak to her mistress. Miss Matty assented and quickly disappeared to change the yellow ribbons while Miss Barker came upstairs, but, as she had forgotten her spectacles and was rather flurried by the unusual time of the visit, I was not surprised to see her return with one cap on the top of the other. She was quite unconscious of it herself and looked at us with bland satisfaction. Nor do I think Miss Barker perceived it, for, putting aside the little circumstance that she was not so young as she had been, she was very much absorbed in her errand, which she delivered herself of with an oppressive modesty that found vent in endless apologies. Miss Betty Barker was the daughter of the old clerk at Cranford who had officiated in Mr. Jenkyns' time. She and her sister had had pretty good situations as ladies' maids and had saved money enough to set up a milliner's shop, which had been patronized by the ladies in the neighborhood. Lady Arley, for instance, would occasionally give Miss Barker's the pattern of an old cap of hers, which they immediately copied and circulated among the elite of Cranford. I say the elite, for Miss Barker's had caught the trick of the place and piqued themselves upon their aristocratic connection. They would not sell their caps and ribbons to anyone without a pedigree. Many a farmer's wife or daughter turned away huffed from Miss Barker's select millinery and went rather to the universal shop, where the profits of brown soap and moist sugar enabled the proprietor to go straight to Paris, he said, until he found his customers too patriotic and John Bullish to wear what the Mounseers wore. London, where, as he often told his customers, Queen Adelaide had appeared only the very week before in a cap exactly like the one he showed them, trimmed with yellow and blue ribbons, and had been complimented by King William on the becoming nature of her head-dress. Miss Barker's, who confined themselves to truth and did not approve of miscellaneous customers, throve notwithstanding. They were self-denying, good people. Many a time have I seen the eldest of them, she that had been maid to Mrs. Jameson, carrying out some delicate mess to a poor person. They only ate their betters in having nothing to do with the class immediately below theirs. And when Miss Barker died, their profits and income were found to be such that Miss Betty was justified in shutting up shop and retiring from business. She also, as I think I have before said, set up her cow, a mark of respectability in Cranford, almost as decided as setting up a gig is among some people. She dressed finer than any lady in Cranford, and we did not wonder at it, for it was understood that she was wearing out all the bonnets and caps and outrageous ribbons which had once formed her stock in trade. It was 5 or 6 years since she had given up shop, so in any other place than Cranford her dress might have been considered passé. And now Miss Betty Barker had called to invite Miss Matty to tea at her house on the following Tuesday. She gave me also an impromptu invitation, as I happened to be a visitor, though I could see she had a little fear lest, since my father had gone to live in Drumble, he might have engaged in that horrid cotton trade and so dragged his family down out of aristocratic society. She prefaced this invitation with so many apologies that she quite excited my curiosity. Her presumption was to be excused. What had she been doing? She seemed so overpowered by it, I could only think that she had been writing to Queen Adelaide to ask for a receipt for washing lace, but the act which she so Characterized was only an invitation she had carried to her sisters. Former mistress, Mrs. Jameson. Her former occupation considered, could Miss Matty excuse the liberty? Ah. Thought I, she has found out that. Double cap and is going to rectify Miss Matty's head dress. No. It was simply to extend her invitation to Miss Matty and to me. Miss Matty bowed acceptance, and I wondered that, in the graceful action, she did not feel the unusual weight and extraordinary height of her head dress. But I do not think she did, for she recovered her balance and went on talking to Miss Betty in a kind, condescending manner, very different from the fidgety way she would have had if she had suspected how singular her appearance was. "Mrs. Jameson is coming, I think you said?" asked Miss Matty. "Yes. Mrs. Jameson most kindly and condescendingly said she would be happy to come. One little stipulation she made, that she should bring Carlo. I told her that if I had a weakness, it was for dogs." "And Miss Pole?" questioned Miss Matty, who was thinking of her poulet preference, in which Carlo would not be available as a partner. "I am going to ask Miss Pole. Of course, I could not think of asking her until I had asked you, madam, the rector's daughter, madam. Believe me, I do not forget the situation my father held under yours. And Mrs. Forrester, of course? And Mrs. Forrester. I thought, in fact, of going to her before I went to Miss Pole. Although her circumstances are changed, madam, she was born at Tyrrell, and we can never forget her alliance to the biggies of Bigelow Hole." Miss Matty cared much more for the little circumstance of her being a very good card player. "Mrs. Fitzadam, I suppose?" "No, madam. I must draw a line somewhere. Mrs. Jameson would not, I think, like to meet Mrs. Fitzadam. I have the greatest respect for Mrs. Fitzadam, but I cannot think her fit society for such ladies as Mrs. Jameson and Miss Matilda Jenkyns." Miss Betty Barker bowed low to Miss Matty and pursed up her mouth. She looked at me with sidelong dignity, as much as to say, although a retired milliner, she was no democrat and understood the difference of ranks. "May I beg you to come as near 6:30 to my little dwelling as possible, Miss Matilda? Mrs. Jameson dines at 5 but has kindly promised not to delay her visit beyond that time, 6:30. And with a swimming curtsy Miss Betty Barker took her leave. My prophetic soul foretold a visit that afternoon from Miss Pole, who usually came to call on Miss Matilda after any event, or indeed in sight of any event, to talk it over with her. Miss Betty told me it was to be a choice and select few, said Miss Pole, as she and Miss Matty compared notes. "Yes, so she said. Not even Mrs. Fitzadam." Now Mrs. Fitzadam was the widowed sister of the Cranford surgeon, whom I have named before. Their parents were respectable farmers, content with their station. The name of these good people was Hoggins. Mr. Hoggins was the Cranford doctor now. We disliked the name and considered it coarse, but, as Miss Jenkyns said, if he changed it to Piggins it would not be much better. We had hoped to discover a relationship between him and that Marchioness of Exeter whose name was Molly Hoggins, but the man, careless of his own interests, utterly ignored and denied any such relationship, although, as dear Miss Jenkyns had said, he had a sister called Mary, and the same Christian names were very apt to run in families. Soon after Miss Mary Hoggins married Mr. Fitzadam, she disappeared from the neighborhood for many years. She did not move in a sphere in Cranford society sufficiently high to make any of us care to know what Mr. Fitzadam was. He died and was gathered to his fathers without our ever having thought about him at all. And then Mrs. Fitzadam reappeared in Cranford, as bold as a lion, Miss Pole said, a well-to-do widow, dressed in rustling black silk, so soon after her husband's death that poor Miss Jenkyns was justified in the remark she made, that Bombazine would have shown a deeper sense of her loss. I remember the convocation of ladies who assembled to decide whether or not Mrs. Fitzadam should be called upon by the old blue-blooded inhabitants of Cranford. She had taken a large rambling house, which had been usually considered to confer a patent of gentility upon its tenant because, once upon a time, 70 or 80 years before, the spinster daughter of an earl had resided in it. I am not sure if the inhabiting this house was not also believed to convey some unusual power of intellect, for the earl's daughter, Lady Jane, had a sister, Lady Anne, who had married a general officer in the time of the American War. And this general officer had written 1 or 2 comedies, which were still acted on the London boards and which, when we saw them advertised, made us all draw up and feel that Drury Lane was paying a very pretty compliment to Cranford. Still, it was not at all a settled thing that Mrs. Fitz-Adam was to be visited when dear Miss Jenkyns died. And, with her, something of the clear knowledge of the strict code of gentility went out too. As Miss Pole observed, as most of the ladies of good family in Cranford were elderly spinsters or widows without children, if we did not relax a little and become less exclusive, by and by we should have no society at all. Mrs. Forrester continued on the same side. She had always understood that Fitz meant something aristocratic. There was Fitzroy. She thought that some of the king's children had been called Fitzroy, and there was Fitzclarence. Now they were the children of dear good King William IV. Fitz-Adam. It was a pretty name. And she thought it very probably meant child of Adam. No one who had not some good blood in their veins would dare to be called Fitz. There was a deal in a name. She had had a cousin who spelt his name with 2 little FFS Falkeys, and he always looked down upon capital letters and said they belonged to lately invented families. She had been afraid he would die a bachelor, he was so very choice. When he met with a Mrs. Farrington at a watering place, he took to her immediately, and a very pretty genteel woman she was, a widow with a very good fortune, and my cousin Mr. Falkeys married her, and it was all owing to her too. Little FFS. Mrs. Fitz-Adam did not stand a chance of meeting with a Mr. Fitz anything in Cranford, so that could not have been her motive for settling there. Miss Matty thought it might have been the hope of being admitted into the society of the place, which would certainly be a very agreeable rise for ci-devant Miss Hoggins, and if this had been her hope it would be cruel to disappoint her. So everybody called upon Mrs. Fitz-Adam, everybody but Mrs. Jameson, who used to show how honorable she was by never seeing Mrs. Fitz-Adam when they met at the Cranford parties. There would be only 8 or 10 ladies in the room, and Mrs. Fitz-Adam was the largest of all, and she invariably used to stand up when Mrs. Jameson came in and curtsy very low to her whenever she turned in her direction, so low, in fact, that I think Mrs. Jameson must have looked at the wall above her, for she never moved a muscle of her face, no more than if she had not seen her. Still, Mrs. Fitz-Adam persevered. The spring evenings were getting bright and long when 3 or 4 ladies in calashes met at Miss Barker's door. Do you know what a calash is? It is a covering worn over caps, not unlike the heads fastened on old-fashioned gigs, but sometimes it is not quite so large. This kind of headgear always made an awful impression on the children in Cranford, and now 2 or 3 left off their play in the quiet, sunny little street and gathered in wondering silence round Miss Pole, Miss Matty, and myself. We were silent too, so that we could hear loud, suppressed whispers inside Miss Barker's house. "Wait, Peggy. Wait. Till I've run upstairs and washed my hands. When I cough, open the door, I'll not be a minute." And, true enough, it was not a minute before we heard a noise between a sneeze and a crow, on which the door flew open. Behind it stood a round-eyed maiden, all aghast at the honorable company of calashes, who marched in without a word. She recovered presence of mind enough to usher us into a small room, which had been the shop but was now converted into a temporary dressing room. There we unpinned and shook ourselves and arranged our features before the glass into a sweet and gracious company face, and then, bowing backwards with "After you, ma'am," we allowed Mrs. Forrester to take precedence up the narrow staircase that led to Miss Barker's drawing room. There she sat, as stately and compassed as though we had never heard that odd-sounding cough, from which her throat must have been even then sore and rough. Kind, gentle, shabbily dressed Mrs. Forrester was immediately conducted to the second place of honor, a seat arranged something like Prince Albert's near the Queen's good, but not so good. The place of preeminence was, of course, reserved for the Honorable Mrs. Jameson, who presently came panting up the stairs, Carlo rushing round her on her progress, as if he meant to trip her up. And now Miss Betty Barker was a proud and happy woman. She stirred the fire and shut the door and sat as near to it as she could, quite on the edge of her chair. When Peggy came in, tottering under the weight of the tea tray, I noticed that Miss Barker was sadly afraid lest Peggy should not keep her distance sufficiently. she and her mistress were on very familiar terms in their everyday intercourse, and Peggy wanted now to make several little confidences to her, which Miss Barker was on thorns to hear, but which she thought it her duty, as a lady, to repress. So she turned away from all Peggy's asides and signs, but she made one or two very malapropos answers to what was said, and at last, seized with a bright idea, she exclaimed, "Poor, sweet Carlo. I'm forgetting him. Come downstairs with me, poor-itty doggy, and it shall have its tea, it shall." In a few minutes she returned, bland and benignant as before, but I thought she had forgotten to give the poor-itty doggy anything to eat, judging by the avidity with which he swallowed down chance pieces of cake. The tea tray was abundantly loaded. I was pleased to see it. I was so hungry, but I was afraid the ladies present might think it vulgarly heaped up. I know they would have done at their own houses. But somehow the heaps disappeared here. I saw Mrs. Jameson eating seed cake slowly and considerately, as she did everything, and I was rather surprised, for I knew she had told us, on the occasion of her last party, that she never had it in her house, it reminded her so much of scented soap. She always gave us Savoy biscuits. However, Mrs. Jameson was kindly indulgent to Miss Barker's want of knowledge of the customs of high life and, to spare her feelings, ate 3 large pieces of seed cake with a placid, ruminating expression of countenance, not unlike a cow's. After tea there was some little demur and difficulty. We were 6 in number, 4 could play at preference, and for the other 2 there was cribbage. But all, except myself, I was rather afraid of the Cranford ladies at cards, for it was the most earnest and serious business they ever engaged in, were anxious to be of the pool. Even Miss Barker, while declaring she did not know Spadille from Manille, was evidently hankering to take a hand. The dilemma was soon put an end to by a singular kind of noise. If a baron's daughter-in-law could ever be supposed to snore, I should have said Mrs. Jameson did so then, for, overcome by the heat of the room and inclined to doze by nature, the temptation of that very comfortable armchair had been too much for her. And Mrs. Jameson was nodding. Once or twice she opened her eyes with an effort and calmly but unconsciously smiled upon us, but by and by, even her benevolence was not equal to this exertion, and she was sound asleep. Picture. The temptation of the comfortable armchair had been too much for her. "It is very gratifying to me," whispered Miss Barker at the card table to her 3 opponents, whom, notwithstanding her ignorance of the game, she was basting most unmercifully. "Very gratifying indeed to see how completely Mrs. Jameson feels at home in my poor little dwelling. She could not have paid me a greater compliment." Miss Barker provided me with some literature in the shape of 3 or 4 handsomely bound fashion books 10 or 12 years old, observing, as she put a little table and a candle for my especial benefit, that she knew young people liked to look at pictures. Carlo lay and snorted and started at his mistress's feet. He, too, was quite at home. The card table was an animated scene to watch, 4 ladies' heads, with niddle-noddling caps, all nearly meeting over the middle of the table in their eagerness to whisper quick enough and loud enough. And every now and then came Miss Barker's "Hush, ladies. If you please, hush. Mrs. Jameson is asleep." It was very difficult to steer clear between Mrs. Forrester's deafness and Mrs. Jameson's sleepiness. But Miss Barker managed her arduous task well. She repeated the whisper to Mrs. Forrester, distorting her face considerably in order to show, by the motions of her lips, what was said, and then she smiled kindly all round at us and murmured to herself, "Very gratifying, indeed. I wish my poor sister had been alive to see this day." Presently the door was thrown wide open, Carlo started to his feet with a loud snapping bark, and Mrs. Jameson awoke. Or, perhaps, she had not been asleep, as she said almost directly. The room had been so light she had been glad to keep her eyes shut, but had been listening with great interest to all our amusing and agreeable conversation. Peggy came in once more, read with importance. "Another tray. Oh, gentility. Thought I, can you endure this last shock?" For Miss Barker had ordered, nay, I doubt not, prepared, although she did say, "Why, Peggy, what have you brought us?" and looked pleasantly surprised at the unexpected pleasure. "All sorts of good things for supper: scalloped oysters, potted lobsters, Jelly, a dish called Little Cupids, which was in great favor with the Cranford ladies, although too expensive to be given, except on solemn and state occasions. Macaroons sopped in brandy, I should have called it, if I had not known its more refined and classical name. In short, we were evidently to be feasted with all that was sweetest and best, and we thought it better to submit graciously, even at the cost of our gentility, which never ate suppers in general, but which, like most non-supper eaters, was particularly hungry on all special occasions. Miss Barker, in her former sphere, had, I dare say, been made acquainted with the beverage they call cherry brandy. We none of us had ever seen such a thing and rather shrank back when she proffered it us just a little glass. Ladies, after the oysters and lobsters, you know. Shellfish are sometimes thought not very wholesome. We all shook our heads like female mandarins, but, at last, Mrs. Jameson suffered herself to be persuaded, and we followed her lead. It was not exactly unpalatable, though so hot and so strong that we thought ourselves bound to give evidence that we were not accustomed to such things by coughing terribly, almost as strangely as Miss Barker had done before we were admitted by Peggy. "It's very strong," said Miss Pole as she put down her empty glass. "I do believe there's spirit in it." "Only a little drop, just necessary to make it keep," said Miss Barker. "You know we put brandy pepper over our preserves to make them keep. I often feel tipsy myself from eating damson tart. I question whether damson tart would have opened Mrs. Jameson's heart as the cherry brandy did, but she told us of a coming event, respecting which she had been quite silent till that moment. My sister-in-law, Lady Glenmire, is coming to stay with me." There was a chorus of "indeed." And then a pause. Each one rapidly reviewed her wardrobe as to its fitness to appear in the presence of a baron's widow, for, of course, a series of small festivals were always held in Cranford on the arrival of a visitor at any of our friends' houses. We felt very pleasantly excited on the present occasion. Not long after this the maids and the lanterns were announced. Mrs. Jameson had the sedan chair, which had squeezed itself into Miss Barker's narrow lobby with some difficulty and most literally stopped the way. It required some skillful maneuvering on the part of the old chairman, shoemakers by day, but when summoned to carry the sedan, dressed up in a strange old livery, long greatcoats with small capes, coeval with the sedan and similar to the dress of the class in Hogarth's pictures, to edge and back and try at it again, and finally to succeed in carrying their burden out of Miss Barker's front door. Then we heard their quick pit-a-pat along the quiet little street as we put on our calashes and pinned up our gowns, Miss Barker hovering about us with offers of help, which, if she had not remembered her former occupation and wished us to forget it, would have been much more pressing. Chapter 8. Your Ladyship. Early the next morning, directly after 12, Miss Pole made her appearance at Miss Matty's. Some very trifling piece of business was alleged as a reason for the call, but there was evidently something behind. At last out it came. "By the way, you'll think I'm strangely ignorant, but do you really? No, I am puzzled how we ought to address Lady Glenmire. Do you say your ladyship where you would say you to a common person? I have been puzzling all morning, and are we to say my lady instead of ma'am? Now you knew Lady Arley, will you kindly tell me the most correct way of speaking to the peerage?" Poor Miss Matty. She took off her spectacles and she put them on again, but how Lady Arley was addressed she could not remember. "It is so long ago," she said. Dear, how stupid I am. I don't think I ever saw her more than twice. I know we used to call Sir Peter, but he came much oftener to see us than Lady Arley did." Deborah would have known in a minute. "My lady, your ladyship. It sounds very strange and as if it was not natural. I never thought of it before, but now you have named it, I am all in a puzzle." It was very certain Miss Pole would obtain no wise decision from Miss Matty, who got more bewildered every moment and more perplexed as to etiquettes of address. "Well, I really think," said Miss Pole, "I had better just go and tell Mrs. Forrester about our little difficulty. One sometimes grows nervous. And yet one would not have Lady Glenmire think we were quite ignorant of the etiquettes of high life in Cranford. And will you just step in here, dear Miss Pole, as you come back, please, and tell me what you decide upon? Whatever you and Mrs. Forrester fix upon, will be quite right, I'm sure. Lady Arley, sir. Peter, said Miss Matty to herself, trying to recall the old forms of words. Who is Lady Glenmire? Asked I. Oh, she's the widow of Mr. Jameson, that's Mrs. Jameson's late husband. You know, widow of his eldest brother. Mrs. Jameson was a Miss Walker. Daughter of Governor Walker. Your ladyship. My dear, if they fix on that way of speaking, you must just let me practice a little on you. First, for I shall feel so foolish and hot saying it the first time to Lady Glenmire. It was really a relief to Miss Matty when Mrs. Jameson came on a very unpolite errand. I noticed that apathetic people have more quiet impertinence than others, and Mrs. Jameson came now to insinuate pretty plainly that she did not particularly wish that the Cranford ladies should call upon her sister-in-law. I can hardly say how she made this clear, for I grew very indignant and warm, while with slow deliberation she was explaining her wishes to Miss Matty, who, a true lady herself, could hardly understand the feeling which made Mrs. Jameson wish to appear to her noble sister-in-law as if she only visited county families. Miss Matty remained puzzled and perplexed long after I had found out the object of Mrs. Jameson's visit. When she did understand the drift of the honorable lady's call, it was pretty to see with what quiet dignity she received the intimation thus uncourteously given. She was not in the least hurt, she was of too gentle a spirit for that, nor was she exactly conscious of disapproving of Mrs. Jameson's conduct, but there was something of this feeling in her mind, I am sure, which made her pass from the subject to others in a less flurried and more compassed manner than usual. Mrs. Jameson was, indeed, the more flurried of the two, and I could see she was glad to take her leave. A little while afterwards Miss Pole returned, red and indignant. Well, to be sure. You've had Mrs. Jameson here, I find from Martha, and we are not to call on Lady Glenmire. Yes. I met Mrs. Jameson halfway between here and Mrs. Forrester's, and she told me, she took me so by surprise, I had nothing to say. I wish I had thought of something very sharp and sarcastic. I dare say I shall tonight. And Lady Glenmire is but the widow of a Scotch baron after all. I went on to look at Mrs. Forrester's peerage to see who this lady was, that is to be kept under the glass case. Widow of a Scotch peer never sat in the House of Lords and as poor as Job, I dare say, and she fifth daughter of some Mr. Campbell or other. You are the daughter of a rector, at any rate, and related to the Arleys, and Sir Peter might have been Viscount Arley, everyone says. Miss Matty tried to soothe Miss Pole, but in vain. That lady, usually so kind and good-humored, was now in a full flow of anger. And I went and ordered a cap this morning, to be quite ready, said she. At last, letting out the secret which gave sting to Mrs. Jameson's intimation. Mrs. Jameson shall see if it is so easy to get me to make forth at a pool when she has none of her fine Scotch relations with her. In coming out of church, the first Sunday on which Lady Glenmire appeared in Cranford, we sedulously talked together and turned our backs on Mrs. Jameson and her guest. If we might not call on her, we would not even look at her, though we were dying with curiosity to know what she was like. We had the comfort of questioning Martha in the afternoon. Martha did not belong to a sphere of society whose observation could be an implied compliment to Lady Glenmire, and Martha had made good use of her eyes. Well, ma'am. Is it the little lady with Mrs. Jameson, you mean? I thought you would like more to know how young Mrs. Smith was dressed, her being a bride. Mrs. Smith was the butcher's wife. Miss Pole said, good gracious me. As if we cared about a Mrs. Smith. But was silent as Martha resumed her speech. The little lady in Mrs. Jameson's pew had on, ma'am, rather an old black silk and a shepherd's plaid cloak, ma'am, and very bright black eyes she had, ma'am, and a pleasant, sharp face, not over young, ma'am. But yet, I should guess, younger than Mrs. Jameson herself. She looked up and down the church like a bird and nipped up her petticoats when she came out, as quick and sharp as ever I see. I'll tell you what. Ma'am, she's more like Mrs. Deacon at the Coach and Horses nor any one. Hush, Martha, said Miss Matty, that's not respectful. Isn't it, ma'am? I beg pardon, I'm sure, but Jem Hearn said so as well. He said she was just such a sharp, stirring sort of a body. Lady, said Miss Pole. Lady as Mrs. Deacon. Another Sunday passed away, and we still averted our eyes from Mrs. Jameson and her guest and made remarks to ourselves that we thought were very severe, almost too much so. Miss Matty was evidently uneasy at our sarcastic manner of speaking. Perhaps by this time Lady Glenmire had found out that Mrs. Jameson's was not the gayest, liveliest house in the world. Perhaps Mrs. Jameson had found out that most of the county families were in London and that those who remained in the country were not so alive as they might have been to the circumstance of Lady Glenmire being in their neighborhood. Great events spring out of small causes, so I will not pretend to say what induced Mrs. Jameson to alter her determination of excluding the Cranford ladies and send notes of invitation all round for a small party on the following Tuesday. Mr. Mulliner himself brought them round. He would always ignore the fact of there being a back door to any house and gave a louder rat-tat than his mistress, Mrs. Jameson. He had 3 little notes, which he carried in a large basket, in order to impress his mistress with an idea of their great weight, though they might easily have gone into his waistcoat pocket. Miss Matty and I quietly decided that we would have a previous engagement at home. It was the evening on which Miss Matty usually made candle lighters of all the notes and letters of the week, for on Mondays her accounts were always made straight, not a penny owing from the week before, so, by a natural arrangement, making candle lighters fell upon a Tuesday evening and gave us a legitimate excuse for declining Mrs. Jameson's invitation. But before our answer was written, in came Miss Pole with an open note in her hand. "So," she said. "Ah. I see you have got your note too. Better late than never. I could have told my Lady Glenmire she would be glad enough of our society before a fortnight was over." "Yes," said Miss Matty, "we're asked for Tuesday evening. And perhaps you would just kindly bring your work across and drink tea with us that night. It is my usual regular time for looking over the last week's bills and notes and letters and making candle lighters of them, but that does not seem quite reason enough for saying I have a previous engagement at home, though I meant to make it do. Now, if you would come, my conscience would be quite at ease, and luckily the note is not written yet." I saw Miss Pole's countenance change while Miss Matty was speaking. "Don't you mean to go then?" asked she. "Oh, no," said Miss Matty quietly. "You don't either, I suppose?" "I don't know," replied Miss Pole. "Yes, I think I do," said she rather briskly, and on seeing Miss Matty look surprised, she added, "You see, one would not like Mrs. Jameson to think that anything she could do or say was of consequence enough to give offense. It would be a kind of letting down of ourselves that I, for one, should not like. It would be too flattering to Mrs. Jameson if we allowed her to suppose that what she had said affected us a week, nay 10 days afterwards. Well, I suppose it is wrong to be hurt and annoyed so long about anything, and, perhaps, after all, she did not mean to vex us. But I must say, I could not have brought myself to say the things Mrs. Jameson did about our not calling. I really don't think I shall go." "Oh, come. Miss Matty, you must go. You know our friend Mrs. Jameson is much more phlegmatic than most people and does not enter into the little delicacies of feeling which you possess in so remarkable a degree. I thought you possessed them, too, that day Mrs. Jameson called to tell us not to go," said Miss Matty innocently. But Miss Pole, in addition to her delicacies of feeling, possessed a very smart cap which she was anxious to show to an admiring world, and so she seemed to forget all her angry words uttered not a fortnight before and to be ready to act on what she called the great Christian principle of forgive and forget, and she lectured dear Miss Matty so long on this head that she absolutely ended by assuring her it was her duty, as a deceased rector's daughter, to buy a new cap and go to the party at Mrs. Jameson's. So we were most happy to accept instead of regretting that we were obliged to decline. Picture. Mr. Mulliner. The expenditure on dress in Cranford was principally in that one article referred to. If the heads were buried in smart new caps, the ladies were like ostriches and cared not what became of their bodies. Old gowns, white and venerable collars, any number of brooches, up and down and everywhere, some with dogs' eyes painted in them, some that were like small picture frames with mausoleums and weeping willows neatly executed in hair inside, some, again, with miniatures of ladies and gentlemen sweetly smiling out of a nest of stiff muslin, old brooches for a permanent ornament, and new caps to suit the fashion of the day. The ladies of Cranford always dressed with chaste elegance and propriety, as Miss Barker once prettily expressed it. And with 3 new caps and a greater array of brooches than had ever been seen together at one time since Cranford was a town, did Mrs. Forrester and Miss Matty and Miss Pole appear on that memorable Tuesday evening. I counted 7 brooches myself on Miss Pole's dress. 2 were fixed negligently in her cap, 1 was a butterfly made of Scotch pebbles, which a vivid imagination might believe to be the real insect, 1 fastened her net neckerchief, 1 her collar, 1 ornamented the front of her gown, midway between her throat and waist, and another adorned the point of her stomacher. Where the 7th was I have forgotten, but it was somewhere about her, I am sure. But I am getting on too fast in describing the dresses of the company. I should first relate the gathering on the way to Mrs. Jameson's. That lady lived in a large house just outside the town. A road which had known what it was to be a street ran right before the house, which opened out upon it without any intervening garden or court. Whatever the sun was about, he never shone on the front of that house. To be sure, the living rooms were at the back, looking onto a pleasant garden. The front windows only belonged to kitchens and housekeepers' rooms and pantries, and in one of them Mr. Mulliner was reported to sit. Indeed, looking askance, we often saw the back of a head covered with hair powder, which also extended itself over his coat collar down to his very waist, and this imposing back was always engaged in reading the Street James Chronicle, opened wide, which, in some degree, accounted for the length of time the said newspaper was in reaching us equal subscribers with Mrs. Jameson, though, in right of her honorableness, she always had the reading of it first. This very Tuesday, the delay in forwarding the last number had been particularly aggravating, just when both Miss Pole and Miss Matty, the former more especially, had been wanting to see it in order to coach up the court news ready for the evening's interview with aristocracy. Miss Pole told us she had absolutely taken time by the forelock and been dressed by 5 o'clock in order to be ready if the St. James Chronicle should come in at the last moment, the very St. James Chronicle which the powdered head was tranquilly and composedly reading as we passed the accustomed window. This evening. The impudence of the man, said Miss Pole in a low indignant whisper. I should like to ask him whether his mistress pays her quarter share for his exclusive use. We looked at her in admiration of the courage of her thought, for Mr. Mulliner was an object of great awe to all of us. He seemed never to have forgotten his condescension in coming to live at Cranford. Miss Jenkyns, at times, had stood forth as the undaunted champion of her sex and spoken to him on terms of equality, but even Miss Jenkyns could get no higher. In his pleasantest and most gracious moods, he looked like a sulky cockatoo. He did not speak except in gruff monosyllables. He would wait in the hall when we begged him not to wait, and then look deeply offended because we had kept him there, while, with trembling, hasty hands we prepared ourselves for appearing in company. Miss Pole ventured on a small joke as we went upstairs, intended, though addressed to us, to afford Mr. Mulliner some slight amusement. We all smiled in order to seem as if we felt at our ease and timidly looked for Mr. Mulliner's sympathy. Not a muscle of that wooden face had relaxed, and we were grave in an instant. Mrs. Jameson's drawing room was cheerful, the evening sun came streaming into it, and the large square window was clustered round with flowers. The furniture was white and gold, not the later style, Louis Quatorze, I think they call it, all shells and twirls. No, Mrs. Jameson's chairs and tables had not a curve or bend about them. The chair and table legs diminished as they neared the ground and were straight and square in all their corners. The chairs were all a row against the walls, with the exception of 4 or 5 which stood in a circle round the fire. They were railed with white bars across the back and knobbed with gold. Neither the railings nor the knobs invited to ease. There was a Japan table devoted to literature, on which lay a Bible, a peerage, and a prayer book. There was another square Pembroke table dedicated to the fine arts, on which were a kaleidoscope, conversation cards, puzzle cards, tied together to an interminable length with faded pink satin ribbon, and a box painted in fond imitation of the drawings which Decorate tea chests. Carlo lay on the worsted worked rug and ungraciously barked at us as we entered. Mrs. Jameson stood up, giving us each a torpid smile of welcome and looking helplessly beyond us at Mr. Mulliner, as if she hoped he would place us in chairs, for, if he did not, she never could. I suppose he thought we could find our way to the circle round the fire, which reminded me of Stonehenge. I don't know why. Lady Glenmire came to the rescue of our hostess, and, somehow or other, we found ourselves for the first time placed agreeably, and not formally, in Mrs. Jameson's house. Lady Glenmire, now we had time to look at her, proved to be a bright little woman of middle age who had been very pretty in the days of her youth and who was even yet very pleasant looking. I saw Miss Pole appraising her dress in the first 5 minutes, and I take her word when she said the next day, "My dear, £10 would have purchased every stitch she had on lace." And all. It was pleasant to suspect that a peeress could be poor and partly reconciled us to the fact that her husband had never sat in the House of Lords, which, when we first heard of it, seemed a kind of swindling us out of our prospects on false pretenses, a sort of a lord and no lord business. We were all very silent at first. We were thinking what we could talk about that should be high enough to interest my lady. There had been a rise in the price of sugar, which, as preserving time was near, was a piece of intelligence to all our housekeeping hearts and would have been the natural topic if Lady Glenmire had not been by. But we were not sure if the peerage ate preserves, much less knew how they were made. At last, Miss Pole, who had always a great deal of courage and savoir faire, spoke to Lady Glenmire, who on her part had seemed just as much puzzled to know how to break the silence as we were. "Has your ladyship been to court lately?" asked she, and then gave a little glance round at us, half timid and half triumphant, as much as to say, "See how judiciously I have chosen a subject befitting the rank of the stranger." "I never was there in my life," said Lady Glenmire, with a broad Scotch accent, but in a very sweet voice. And then, as if she had been too abrupt, she added, "We very seldom went to London, only twice, in fact. During all my married life, and before I was married, my father had far too large a family. Fifth daughter of Mr. Campbell was in all our minds, I am sure, to take us often from our home, even to Edinburgh." "You'll have been in Edinburgh, maybe?" said she, suddenly brightening up with the hope of a common interest. We had none of us been there, but Miss Pole had an uncle who once had passed a night there, which was very pleasant. Mrs. Jameson, meanwhile, was absorbed in wonder why Mr. Mulliner did not bring the tea, and at length the wonder oozed out of her mouth. "I had better ring the bell, my dear, had not I?" said Lady Glenmire briskly. "No, I think not. Mulliner does not like to be hurried. We should have liked our tea, for we dined at an earlier hour than Mrs. Jameson." I suspect Mr. Mulliner had to finish the St. James Chronicle before he chose to trouble himself about tea. His mistress fidgeted and kept saying, "I can't think why Mulliner does not bring tea. I can't think what he can be about." And Lady Glenmire at last grew quite impatient, but it was a pretty kind of impatience after all, and she rang the bell rather sharply on receiving a half permission from her sister-in-law to do so. Mr. Mulliner appeared in dignified surprise. "Oh," said Mrs. Jameson, "Lady Glenmire rang the bell, I believe it was for tea." In a few minutes tea was brought. Very delicate was the china, very old the plate, very thin the bread and butter, and very small the lumps of sugar. Sugar was evidently Mrs. Jameson's favorite economy. I question if the little filigree sugar tongs, made something like scissors, could have opened themselves wide enough to take up an honest vulgar good-sized piece, and when I tried to seize 2 little minikin pieces at once so as not to be detected in too many returns to the sugar basin, they absolutely dropped one with a little sharp clatter, quite in a malicious and unnatural manner. But before this happened we had a slight disappointment. In the little silver jug was cream, in the larger one was milk. As soon as Mr. Mulliner came in, Carlo began to beg, which was a thing our manners forbade us to do, though I am sure we were just as hungry, and Mrs. Jameson said she was certain we would excuse her if she gave her poor dumb Carlo his tea first. She accordingly mixed a saucerful for him and put it down for him to lap. And then she told us how intelligent and sensible the dear little fellow was. He knew cream quite well and constantly refused tea with only milk in it. So the milk was left for us, but we silently thought we were quite as intelligent and sensible as Carlo and felt as if insult were added to injury when we were called upon to admire the gratitude evinced by his wagging his tail for the cream which should have been ours. After tea we thawed down into common life subjects. We were thankful to Lady Glenmire for having proposed some more bread and butter, and this mutual want made us better acquainted with her than we should ever have been with talking about the court, though Miss Pole did say she had hoped to know how the dear Queen was from someone who had seen her. The friendship begun over bread and butter extended on to cards. Lady Glenmire played preference to admiration and was a complete authority as to ombre and quadrille. Even Miss Pole quite forgot to say my lady and your ladyship and said basto. Ma'am, you have spadille. I believe just as quietly as if we had never held the great Cranford Parliament on the subject of the proper mode of addressing a peeress. As a proof of how thoroughly we had forgotten that we were in the presence of one who might have sat down to tea with a coronet instead of a cap on her head, Mrs. Forrester related a curious little fact to Lady Glenmire, an anecdote known to the circle of her intimate friends, but of which even Mrs. Jameson was not aware. It related to some fine old lace, the sole relic of better days, which Lady Glenmire was admiring on Mrs. Forrester's collar. Yes, said that lady, such lace cannot be got now for either love or money, made by the nuns abroad, they tell me. They say that they can't make it now even there. But perhaps they can, now they've passed a Catholic Emancipation Bill. I should not wonder. But, in the meantime, I treasure up my lace very much. I daren't even trust a washing of it to my maid, the little charity school girl I have named before, but who sounded well as my maid. I always wash it myself. And once it had a narrow escape. Of course, your ladyship knows that such lace must never be starched or ironed. Some people wash it in sugar and water. And some in coffee to make it the right yellow color, but I myself have a very good receipt for washing it in milk, which stiffens it enough and gives it a very good creamy color. Well, ma'am, I had tacked it together, and the beauty of this fine lace is that, when it is wet, it goes into a very little space and put it to soak in milk. When, unfortunately, I left the room, on my return, I found Pussy on the table, looking very like a thief, but gulping very uncomfortably, as if she was half choked with something she wanted to swallow and could not. And, would you believe it? At first I pitied her and said poor Pussy. Poor Pussy. Till, all at once, I looked and saw the cup of milk empty, cleaned out. You naughty cat, said I, and I believe I was provoked enough to give her a slap, which did no good, but only helped the lace down just as one slaps a choking child on the back. I could have cried, I was so vexed, but I determined I would not give the lace up without a struggle for it. I hoped the lace might disagree with her. At any rate, but it would have been too much for Job if he had seen, as I did, that cat come in, quite placid and purring, not a quarter of an hour after, and almost expecting to be stroked. No, Pussy, said I. If you have any conscience you ought not to expect that. And then a thought struck me, and I rang the bell for my maid and sent her to Mr. Hoggins with my compliments, and would he be kind enough to lend me one of his top boots for an hour? I did not think there was anything odd in the message, but Jenny said the young men in the surgery laughed as if they would be ill at my wanting a top boot. When it came, Jenny and I put Pussy in, with her 4 feet straight down, so that they were fastened and could not scratch, and we gave her a teaspoonful of currant jelly in which, your ladyship must excuse me, I had mixed some tartar emetic. I shall never forget how anxious I was for the next half hour. I took Pussy to my own room and spread a clean towel on the floor. I could have kissed her when she returned the lace to sight. Very much as it had gone down. Jenny had boiling water ready, and we soaked it and spread it on a lavender bush in the sun. Before I could touch it again, even to put it in milk. But now your ladyship would never guess that it had been in Pussy's inside picture. We gave her a teaspoonful of currant jelly. We found out, in the course of the evening, that Lady Glenmire was going to pay Mrs. Jameson a long visit, as she had given up her apartments in Edinburgh and had no ties to take her back there in a hurry. On the whole, we were rather glad to hear this, for she had made a pleasant impression upon us, and it was also very comfortable to find, from things which dropped out in the course of conversation, that, in addition to many other genteel qualities, she was far removed from the vulgarity of wealth. "Don't you find it very unpleasant walking?" asked Mrs. Jameson, as our respective servants were announced. It was a pretty regular question from Mrs. Jameson, who had her own carriage in the coach house and always went out in a sedan chair to the very shortest distances. The answers were nearly as much a matter of course. "Oh dear, no. It is so pleasant and still at night. Such a refreshment after the excitement of a party. The stars are so beautiful." This last was from Miss Matty. "Are you fond of astronomy?" Lady Glenmire asked. "Not very," replied Miss Matty, rather confused at the moment to remember which was astronomy and which was astrology, but the answer was true under either circumstance, for she read and was slightly alarmed at Francis Moore's astrological predictions, and, as to astronomy, in a private and confidential conversation, she had told me she never could believe that the earth was moving constantly and that she would not believe it if she could. It made her feel so tired and dizzy whenever she thought about it. In our pattens we picked our way home with extra care that night, so refined and delicate were our perceptions after drinking tea with my lady. Chapter 9. Signor Brunoni. Soon after the events of which I gave an account in my last paper, I was summoned home by my father's illness, and for a time I forgot, in anxiety about him, to wonder how my dear friends at Cranford were getting on, or how Lady Glenmire could reconcile herself to the dullness of the long visit which she was still paying to her sister-in-law Mrs. Jameson. When my father grew a little stronger I accompanied him to the seaside, so that altogether I seemed banished from Cranford and was deprived of the opportunity of hearing any chance intelligence of the dear little town for the greater part of that year. Late in November, when we had returned home again and my father was once more in good health, I received a letter from Miss Matty, and a very mysterious letter it was. She began many sentences without ending them, running them one into another in much the same confused sort of way in which written words run together on blotting paper. All I could make out was that, if my father was better, which she hoped he was, and would take warning and wear a greatcoat from Michaelmas to Lady Day, if turbans were in fashion, could I tell her? Such a piece of gaiety was going to happen as had not been seen or known of since Wombwell's lions came, when one of them ate a little child's arm, and she was, perhaps, too old to care about dress, but a new cap she must have, and, having heard that turbans were worn, and some of the county families likely to come, she would like to look tidy if I would bring her a cap from the milliner I employed, and oh, dear, how careless of her to forget that. She wrote to beg I would come and pay her a visit next Tuesday, when she hoped to have something to offer me in the way of amusement, which she would not now more particularly describe, only sea green was her favorite color. So she ended her letter, but in a PS she added, she thought she might as well tell me what was the peculiar attraction to Cranford just now. Signor Brunoni was going to exhibit his wonderful magic in the Cranford Assembly Rooms on Wednesday and Friday evening in the following week. I was very glad to accept the invitation from my dear Miss Matty, independently of the conjurer, and most particularly anxious to prevent her from disfiguring her small, gentle, mousy face with a great Saracen's head turban, and accordingly, I bought her a pretty, neat, middle-aged cap, which, however, was rather a disappointment to her. When, on my arrival, she followed me into my bedroom, ostensibly to poke the fire, but in reality, I do believe, to see if the sea green turban was not inside the cap box with which I had traveled. It was in vain that I twirled the cap round on my hand to exhibit back and side fronts. Her heart had been set upon a turban, and all she could do was to say, with resignation in her look and voice, "I am sure you did your best, my dear. It is just like the caps all the ladies in Cranford are wearing, and they have had theirs for a year. I dare say I should have liked something newer, I confess something more like the turbans Miss Betty Barker tells me Queen Adelaide wears, but it is very pretty, my dear. And I dare say lavender will wear better than sea green. Well, after all, what is dress, that we should care anything About it? You'll tell me if you want anything, my dear. Here is the bell. I suppose turbans have not got down to Drumble yet?" So saying, the dear old lady gently bemoaned herself out of the room, leaving me to dress for the evening when, as she informed me, she expected Miss Pole and Mrs. Forrester and she hoped I should not feel myself too much tired to join the party. Of course I should not, and I made some haste to unpack and arrange my dress, but, with all my speed, I heard the arrivals and the buzz of conversation in the next room. Before I was ready, just as I opened the door, I caught the words, "I was foolish to expect anything very genteel out of the Drumble shops. Poor girl. She did her best, I've no doubt. But, for all that, I had rather that she blamed Drumble and me than disfigured herself with a